I've always been a bit of a loner, and sometimes the world just feels like too much. It gets suffocating, and when that happens, I usually find a way to disappear for a while. Get lost in nature and try to detox from the chaos I bring on myself. This time, I decided to go camping by the Mississippi River in Illinois, an area managed by the Army Corps of Engineers. It was public land, free for camping, and I figured it would be the perfect spot to just reset. The drive was about 4 hours, which wasn't too bad. I had no real plans other than to find a quiet place, light a fire, and spend the next few days in solitude. I wasn't expecting much, just the kind of peace you can only get from being alone with nature. The further I got from the city, the more my thoughts started to clear. I found myself just focusing on the road, the gentle hum of the engine, and the occasional glance at the trees that seemed to grow thicker as I drove deeper into the wilderness. When I arrived, it was late afternoon, and the weather was still holding up. I parked my car near the edge of a small clearing that overlooked the river. There were no other cars around, no signs of civilization, just the quiet buzz of insects, the chirping of birds, and the steady flow of the water. Perfect. I set up my tent, unpacked a few things, and gathered some wood for a fire. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and I could feel the temperature dropping, so I made sure to get the fire going before it got too cold. The flames crackled and popped as they caught hold of the dry wood, and I settled back against my pack, staring into the warmth, letting the crackling sound drown out everything else. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel small in a good way. The rain started as I was finishing my dinner. It wasn't heavy at first, just a light drizzle, but it picked up fast. I put the fire out to be safe, zipped up the tent, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The rain was soothing, the sound of it hitting the tent like a soft percussion. It felt good to be inside, away from the dampness, surrounded by the smell of wet earth and pine. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up to a rustling noise outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe an animal moving through the underbrush, but the noise was too deliberate, too close. My heart started racing. I reached for the flashlight next to me, turned it on, and shone it out the tent door. The beam cut through the dark, revealing a man standing just outside, staring directly at the entrance of my tent. He was only about 10 feet away. I froze. The man was tall, scraggly, and his face, it was covered in scars. I couldn't tell if it was from an accident, some kind of skin disease, or something else entirely, but it was unsettling. His skin was blotchy, uneven, and there were deep lines across his cheeks. He was dressed in tattered clothes, and his hair was wild, sticking out in all directions. His eyes were wide, but there was no aggression in them, just an emptiness I couldn't quite place. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring at the tent. I couldn't see his expression clearly, but there was something in the way he stood that made my skin crawl. I didn't know what to do. Should I yell? Should I ask if he needed help? I opened the tent door slowly, making sure not to startle him, and asked in a low voice if he was okay. His eyes didn't break from mine. His face didn't change. Finally, he spoke in a low, raspy voice, saying something about how he'd been wandering these woods for a while. I wasn't sure what to think. He didn't seem threatening, not at first. I hesitated for a moment, but then I decided to invite him to sit by the fire. I didn't want to be rude, and honestly, I felt kind of bad for the guy. He had a weathered look about him, like he'd been through hell. Maybe he was just looking for company. I figured I was safe enough. I wasn't scared of him. Not really, not at that moment. But there was something about him that made me uneasy. We sat by the fire for a while, the rain having subsided into a light drizzle. He started talking, and at first, it was just normal conversation. Nothing too strange. He introduced himself, though I didn't catch the name, and I told him I was just camping for a few days to get away. He seemed friendly enough, though his words came out in fits and starts, like his thoughts weren't entirely coherent. He kept asking me for cigarettes, though I told him I didn't smoke. Every few minutes, he'd offer me something in exchange for a cigarette, his hobo stove, some animal pelts, a handful of string. I kept turning him down, trying to be polite, but it became clear that he didn't quite understand that I wasn't interested. As the conversation went on, his words grew stranger. He started talking about survival, about hunting and trapping, things I didn't really know much about. He seemed to know a lot, though, teaching me how to trap small animals and how to skin them. He even showed me a few animal hides he had draped over his bicycle, explaining how he used every part of the animals he killed. The more he spoke, the more I realized how much he actually knew. I had never met anyone who could speak so passionately about survival, especially in such a strange, off-the-grid way. But then, things started to take a darker turn. He started talking about the animals he killed, how eating them would give him their strength and intelligence. I tried to nod along, but there was something in his voice, something about the way he spoke, that made my stomach twist. He wasn't just talking about survival anymore. He was talking about something deeper, something unsettling. And then he said something that made me freeze in place. He started talking about how he would kill other things for their energy. His words were disjointed, hard to follow, but I could tell he was talking about rape. Not just of humans, but of animals as well. His voice wavered as he spoke, and I wasn't sure if he was just rambling or if there was something much more sinister behind his words. It wasn't the kind of thing you just brush off, no matter how confused or scattered he seemed. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I couldn't stay by the fire anymore. I tried to focus on the fire, on the way the flames flickered and danced, but all I could think about was what he had said. My mind was racing. He seemed so off, so far gone. I was in the middle of nowhere, with no one around for miles, and this guy was clearly dealing with some serious mental health issues. I didn't think he was dangerous, at least not in a way that he was aware of, but there was no way I was going to sleep near him with those knives he had shown me. I didn't want to make him feel rejected, but I knew I had to get away. So, I told him I was going to drive into town to grab some cigarettes and that I'd be back soon. He seemed genuinely excited about the prospect of me leaving, as though he didn't want to be alone either. He waved me off as I gathered my things and got into the car. I drove off without looking back, my heart pounding in my chest. The thought of going to town seemed like the only thing I could do. I didn't want to risk staying there any longer, even though part of me felt guilty. I crossed the Mississippi River into Iowa, heading toward Clinton, a small town that didn't offer much more than a few old buildings and a sense of isolation. I found a casino on the edge of town and decided to stop in. I had no real intention of gambling, but I figured I might as well waste a few dollars. I lost $5 and then just wandered around for a bit. It was the kind of place that felt empty even when it was full of people. I left quickly, realizing how much I hated the vibe of the town. Nothing felt right. So, I drove around a bit more, eventually parking in a park near a playground. I didn't care where I was. I was just exhausted and wanted to get some sleep. I woke up the next morning to the sound of children playing, their laughter cutting through the morning air. The sunlight was already peeking through the trees, and I knew it was time to leave. The whole trip had been a disaster. What was supposed to be a peaceful retreat from my problems had turned into a nightmare. I didn't feel like I had gotten away from anything, only that I had run into something I couldn't understand. I left Clinton and drove home, my mind still racing. The trip had been ruined, not by the place, but by the person I'd met in those woods. The man by the river, with his scars, his strange teachings, and his unsettling words, would haunt me for a long time. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something much worse than just a bad encounter with a stranger. The weirdest part of it all? I couldn't decide if I was relieved or disturbed by the fact that, for the first time in a long while, I had truly been scared. I once went camping in the Santa Barbara backcountry with a couple of friends. We hiked in about 10 miles from the trailhead, leaving behind the last signs of civilization. The area was quiet, deep in the hills where the trees were thick, and the ground was covered in brush and rocks. The sounds of our footsteps and the occasional bird call were the only noises that filled the air as we made our way along the narrow, winding trail. It was the kind of place where the weight of the world felt far away, and for a while it seemed like there was no one else around for miles. We'd spent a few days there already, finding a great spot near a small creek, with the sound of running water lulling us to sleep every night. The weather had been perfect, cool in the mornings and evenings, with the sun warming us in the middle of the day. It was peaceful, the kind of camping trip you hope for, where nothing goes wrong and the days feel like they stretch on forever. But that last morning, everything changed. We were packing up our camp after making breakfast. The sun was just starting to climb higher in the sky, the light filtering through the trees, and the air was crisp with the smell of pine and fresh earth. My friends were folding up the tent and organizing our gear. I was finishing off the last of the coffee, standing by the campfire, when I first heard it. Voices. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but then they came again, clearer this time. Quiet, low voices, but enough that we could hear them. They seemed to be coming from the hillside above our camp, up the trail. It wasn't unusual to hear the occasional hiker, especially on the main trail, but something was off about it. The voices didn't get any louder. They didn't sound like they were coming closer, as they should have if it was someone moving down the trail toward us. Instead, it seemed like they were just lingering up there, watching us, talking to each other as if they didn't realize we could hear them. I stood there, staring up at the ridge where the voices came from, trying to make out what they were saying. But the words were too indistinct, and I couldn't pick up much. I glanced at my friends, who also looked uneasy. It was one of those moments when the atmosphere shifts, when the hair on the back of your neck rises, and you feel like something is off even though you can't quite put your finger on it. After about an hour of this strange silence, we finally saw them. Two men appeared, walking down the trail toward us. They looked like they'd been out for a while, carrying rifles slung over their shoulders and large backpacks with antlers sticking out of the top. They were middle-aged, and their appearance seemed to confirm the vibe I was picking up earlier. The taller one, who was thin and quiet, kept his distance as they walked toward us. The shorter one, stockier and more solid, came straight toward us without hesitation. As he got closer, he squinted at us and grunted, "So what kind of weed you guys smoking?" We all froze, unsure how to respond at first. Of course, we had been smoking some weed. We weren't exactly hiding it, but it felt odd that he would come up and ask about it, like he was probing for something. I didn't think much about it at the time, but looking back, the whole situation felt a little off from the start. My friend, trying to keep things light, shrugged and said, "Oh, just some swag." But we finished it off. At that, the shorter man smiled and reached into his shirt pocket, pulling out a small pipe. He handed it to my two friends first, who both took a hit and then offered it to me. I didn't want to take it. I had no interest in smoking more, especially with strangers who seemed a bit odd. When I refused, the man didn't seem to mind, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than I was comfortable with. He didn't say anything, just nodded and stuffed the pipe back into his pocket. Then, without warning, he unstrapped his backpack and threw it at me. It landed with a heavy thud at my feet. I barely had time to react before he asked, "How much do you think that weighs?" I wasn't sure where this was going, but I bent down and checked the backpack, seeing the antlers poking out the top, with blood dripping from the bottom. It made sense, these men were hunters. I picked it up, testing its weight, and guessed, maybe 35-40 pounds? The man nodded, grinning. "That's right. We butchered a deer back there," he said, motioning toward the woods. "Had to pack it out, all the way from the backcountry." That was when they introduced themselves. The short, gruff one was Ralph, and the tall, quiet one was Keith. Ralph went on to explain that they had been childhood friends in Santa Barbara and had been hunting in these hills for years. It was a tradition for them to meet up every year for a hunting trip, something they'd been doing for decades. Keith had gone on to marry a district attorney in Santa Barbara, while Ralph had moved up to the mountains outside Yosemite and worked in power line maintenance, inspecting for fallen trees and other issues. They weren't unfriendly, but there was something about them, something strange in the way they carried themselves, that made me uneasy. They talked about their families and their yearly hunting trips like it was just another part of life, and they seemed to take pride in their backcountry knowledge. But there was a coldness to their demeanor that set my nerves on edge. They stayed for a while, chatting casually about the area and their hunting experiences. Ralph even offered us some jerky, which we politely declined. They didn't seem to take offense, just nodded and kept talking. But the longer they stayed, the more I felt like something wasn't quite right. Keith, the taller one, hadn't said much at all. He just stood off to the side, watching us with an intensity that I couldn't ignore. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was sizing us up, observing every move we made. Ralph was the more talkative one, but even his voice had a rough edge to it. It wasn't exactly threatening, but it carried a weight that made me uncomfortable. There was a hardness in the way he moved and spoke, like he was used to being out here in the wild and wasn't easily rattled by anything. They eventually decided to leave, and I felt a small sense of relief as they made their way back down the trail. I'm not sure what it was exactly. Maybe the fact that they were hunters or the way they seemed to know this area so well, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched even after they disappeared from view. As we finished packing up our camp, I found myself scanning the woods more than usual, half expecting to see them lurking in the shadows. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that we were just being paranoid, but the unease lingered in the pit of my stomach. We made our way back down the trail, keeping a steady pace as we descended toward the trailhead. The woods around us were still quiet, but it felt like we weren't as alone as we had been when we first arrived. I couldn't stop thinking about Ralph and Keith, wondering if they were still out there somewhere, watching us from the trees. By the time we reached the trailhead, I was glad to be back in the open. The sun was high in the sky, and the hike had been long, but we made it out without incident. We all breathed a little easier as we loaded up into the car and drove away from the backcountry, the familiar sights of civilization slowly reappearing. Looking back, I'm still not sure what to make of those men. Were they just strange, harmless hunters, or was there something more to their presence out there in the backcountry? I'll never know for sure, but that feeling, the one that gnawed at me while we were still in the woods, never quite left. Something about the way they approached us, the way they moved, the way they watched us, it felt off. It felt like we were part of their world now, whether we wanted to be or not. And I couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, they were always a little closer than we thought. I've been back to the Santa Barbara backcountry a few times since then, but I've always kept an eye out for things that seem out of place. The woods are full of secrets, some of them more unsettling than others, and sometimes it's better to just trust your gut when something feels wrong. That trip was supposed to be just another peaceful getaway, but it ended up being a reminder that not everyone you meet out there is as friendly as they seem. Some people are just waiting for the right moment to see if you'll make the wrong move. The night was dead silent, the kind of silence that makes you feel like something's just around the corner, hiding, waiting for you to let your guard down. It was the middle of the night, pitch black, except for the pale green glow from the night vision goggles I had strapped over my eyes. The kind of silence that makes you wonder if you're even supposed to be out there in the first place, but you don't have a choice. I was on guard duty at what we call Checkpoint Charlie, part of a temporary base set up deep in a forest for a training exercise. My battle buddy and I had been out there for what felt like forever, eyes scanning every corner of the woods, trying to pick up on any movement. We were in full military gear, rifles in hand, and everything about the situation screamed tension. It wasn't a normal drill. There wasn't anything scheduled for the night. No planned scenarios, just us in the dark, keeping watch over a piece of land that felt bigger than it should. The time was around 1 a.m., and the forest felt like it was swallowing everything. The trees were like dark sentinels, reaching up into the sky like something that didn't belong to the world of men. My job was simple: watch, report, don't mess up. We had a small temporary camp set up with a few tents, a small perimeter, and a couple of trenches. It wasn't much, but it was enough. At least it was enough to feel like I was supposed to be there, doing what I was supposed to be doing. Or at least that's how it seemed until everything changed. I was staring through my night vision goggles when I saw them, for figures. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe my eyes were just playing tricks on me in the dark, but I stared harder, adjusted the focus on the goggles, and they didn't disappear. No, they were still there, four shapes moving slowly, crawling toward the edge of the camp, toward the trenches we were supposed to be guarding. It wasn't normal. People don't crawl that slowly, especially not in the middle of a forest where the ground's covered in leaves and debris. It looked wrong. They were so slow, so deliberate. I immediately felt my heart rate pick up, a knot forming in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I knew what I had to do. Protocol kicked in, and I grabbed the radio to contact our guard commander. My voice came out steady, even though my heart was pounding. "Sir, we have movement for shapes crawling toward our position. I need confirmation. Over." There was a brief pause before the commander responded. "There shouldn't be anyone out there. Keep observing and report back. No planned scenarios tonight. Just watch." His voice sounded calm, but I could hear the tension under the surface. We were out in the middle of nowhere, after all. Who else could be out here, especially at this time of night? I handed the night vision goggles over to my buddy, who took a long look. He didn't say anything at first, but I could see his face harden as he adjusted the goggles and focused. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke in a low voice. "Yeah, I see them too. Same as you. For people crawling." It was surreal. It didn't make sense. What kind of person crawls through the woods in the middle of the night, especially when there are soldiers with weapons watching every move? The shapes were too far out for us to make out any detail, but I could tell from the way they moved, slow, deliberate, that they weren't just lost hikers or camp visitors. They weren't just out there by accident. I knew what I had to do. I stood up from our trench, rifle in hand, and moved toward the edge of the camp. My buddy kept watching them through the night vision goggles, still confirming that they hadn't stopped, that they were still crawling toward us, slow and steady. I shouted out into the night, my voice cracking through the silence, breaking the eerie quiet that had settled around us. "This is military. Stand up. Identify yourselves now." There was no response, just the sound of the forest, the wind moving through the trees, the rustle of leaves. Nothing from the shapes, not even a sound. My buddy, still looking through the goggles, confirmed that they hadn't stopped moving. They were still crawling, still coming closer. I turned around, and by that time my commander had arrived. He came sprinting down from the command post, his pistol drawn and ready. He had his own night vision goggles on, and when he reached me, he immediately turned to the figures, taking a look for himself. He didn't speak at first, but I could tell by the way he looked through the goggles that he saw exactly what we saw. The shapes were still there, still crawling toward us, getting closer with every minute that passed. Something in the air had changed. It felt heavy, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. It wasn't just the figures. It was the whole situation. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Without a word, the commander set off, determined to confront whatever it was. He moved quickly, almost recklessly, his anger clearly mounting. I don't think he was fully aware of how tense the situation had become. He was angry that someone was out there, violating our perimeter. He moved toward the figures, yelling out again, telling them to stop and identify themselves. I stayed behind, my rifle aimed in their direction, waiting just in case. My heart pounded louder than my thoughts. I felt the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The commander got closer, his voice getting louder, angrier. He was about to reach them, to do what I think was meant to be a forceful confrontation, when, just like that, the figures vanished. 1 second they were there, crawling toward us, and the next, they were gone. It wasn't like they stood up and ran away. No, they just weren't there anymore, as if they had melted into the darkness, as if they had never existed. The commander stopped dead in his tracks, looking around, confused, scanning the area. There was no sound, no movement, nothing. Just the forest still as death. He called out to me, his voice tight. "What the hell? Did you see that?" I couldn't answer. I was still staring at the spot where they had been. My buddy was still in the trench, his face pale, staring through the goggles, trying to make sense of it. But there was nothing to see. The figures were gone, vanished without a trace. The commander moved back toward me, his steps slow, his gun still drawn, his eyes darting around, trying to figure out what had just happened. I couldn't explain it. Neither could he. Neither could my buddy. The figures didn't run off into the forest. They didn't stand up and make a break for it. They didn't vanish in the way someone might expect from a ghost story or some supernatural nonsense. No, they just weren't there anymore. There was no logical explanation. We had checked the area for tracks, for signs of movement, but there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had been there. It was as if the entire thing had been some kind of mirage, some weird trick the darkness played on our eyes. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I felt. My hands were still shaking from the adrenaline, but the questions didn't stop. What were they doing? Why were they crawling? Why hadn't they responded when I called out? And why, when we were all certain they were there, did they disappear into the night like they had never been real? We checked the perimeter again, just to be sure. We didn't find anything. No signs of anyone nearby, no evidence that anyone had come close. The rest of the night passed uneventfully after that, but the questions lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The commander called it a training incident, a glitch in the system, something that didn't make sense but could be explained away. But deep down, I knew that there was no easy explanation for what happened out there that night. We didn't talk about it much after that. Not to anyone, anyway. Some things just don't need to be explained. Sometimes you just know there's more to the story than anyone's willing to admit. But I'll never forget the way they disappeared, how 1 second they were there, and the next they were gone. Just like that. And the forest? It never felt the same after that. It's like something had shifted, something that wasn't meant to be understood, and I still don't know what to make of it. I just know that when you're out there in the woods, in the dark, your mind starts playing tricks on you. But sometimes it's not the mind. Sometimes it's something else. Something that doesn't want to be understood. It was summer and I was about 10 years old. My friends and I had been planning this camping trip for weeks, eager to get away from our parents and spend the night in the woods behind our houses. We were all excited, though none of us had ever really camped before. The forest wasn't far from the town, just a short walk through a patch of farmland, but it felt like we were stepping into a whole different world. The trees were tall, dark, and thick, their branches twisting and turning to block out most of the light. It wasn't exactly a dense forest, but it was enough to make us feel small, as if nature had wrapped itself around us and closed us off from the rest of the world. We'd set up our tents near a small clearing, just at the edge of the forest where the trees broke off and a patch of grass grew thick. The ground was uneven, but that didn't stop us from piling out our sleeping bags, grabbing sticks for the fire, and throwing our backpacks off to the side. The day had been hot, but by evening, the air had cooled just enough to make things comfortable. We started the fire quickly and gathered around it, trying to ignore the mosquitoes that buzzed around our heads. The atmosphere felt different at night. Even though we were close to the village, there was a certain quiet in the forest that gave me a sense of unease, like we were intruding. It wasn't a big deal. Kids didn't get scared that easily, especially not when they had each other for company. But as the shadows stretched long and the evening grew darker, I started to feel like something was watching us. Still, I didn't say anything. We started telling stories, the kind of silly tales you'd expect from a group of 10-year-olds. The one about the ghostly hitchhiker, the one about the man with the hook for a hand, and the one about the monster that lurked in the woods. I was the first to bring up the wolf story. I'd heard it from my uncle, who had always been the kind of person to tell creepy stories about the wilderness. He said that years ago, a pack of wolves had been spotted deep in the forest where we were camping. He told me they were rare, but they still roamed that part of the forest, hunting in the night. I told the others this story, trying to make it as spooky as I could. I could see the skepticism on their faces, and they quickly dismissed it. Wolves? In Denmark? Everyone knew wolves hadn't been around in this part of the country for decades. They were gone, wiped out by hunting and the loss of their habitat. The idea of a wolf pack in the forest seemed ridiculous. Yeah, sure, wolves. One of the boys, Mikkel, said with a chuckle. That's a good one, but there are no wolves here. Everyone knows that. Couldn't let it go. I was sure what my uncle said was true, even if no one else believed it. Maybe they were gone, but who was to say that they didn't come back? Maybe just a few had been hiding out, living deep in the forest where no one would find them. Maybe they were out there right now watching us. I had to come up with some proof, something that would make them believe me. Okay, fine, I said, but I've heard them howl. Right here. I've heard it myself. Mikkel and the others rolled their eyes, and I could see them glancing at each other, waiting for me to crack a smile and admit I was just making it up. But I was serious. The fire crackled, and the air felt cold. The others sat back, looking at me, unsure of what to say next. "Yeah, right," Mikkel said again. "I bet you can't even howl like a wolf." I'd been waiting for this moment. It wasn't just about proving wolves were out there anymore. It was about showing them I was right. So I stood up, cupped my hands around my mouth, and let out a long, drawn-out howl. It wasn't perfect, but it was close enough. The sound broke the quiet of the forest and seemed to hang in the air, echoing against the trees. For a second, the others just stared at me. Then, just when I thought they would burst into laughter, it happened. We heard a howl in the distance. It was low and long, just like the one I'd made. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced around, my eyes darting from the others' faces to the darkness beyond the firelight. That's not possible," Mikkel said, his voice wavering just a bit. I felt the same way. A wolf howl. Here, I quickly scanned the edge of the forest, but there was nothing, just shadows stretching far into the trees. Before we could say anything, there was another howl. Closer, louder, sent a shiver down my spine. It was like the wolf had responded to me, answering my call. My mind raced. Wolves couldn't be here. Could they? No, they couldn't. But they were howling, and it was happening now, right in front of us. Then, another one. A third howl from a different direction, even closer. My blood ran cold. The firelight flickered, casting shadows that danced like ghosts in the trees. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. "Okay, that's it. We need to go," Mikkel said, his voice a mix of panic and disbelief. Without another word, we grabbed our stuff, scrambling to pack up as quickly as we could. There was no laughing now. The forest around us suddenly felt menacing, like something was waiting for us to make a mistake. We didn't know if it was wolves or something else, but the howls were real. The fear in our chests was real. We ran. Usain Bolt would have been impressed with how fast we moved. I've never seen anyone sprint like that, our legs carrying us over the uneven ground as we dashed back toward the house. The air felt colder, the trees closing in around us like they were trying to trap us. The howl that followed us, that final eerie cry, was the last straw. We didn't look back. The house came into view, and we ran up to the front door, slamming it shut behind us. Our hearts were still racing, our breaths coming in gasps. We leaned against the door, trying to calm ourselves, but the fear hadn't gone away. We didn't even bother to start the fire back up. We just huddled in the living room, too scared to even talk about what had happened. The next morning, when we finally dared to venture back into the forest, we learned the truth. We weren't the only ones camping out there. Some drunk teenagers had decided to mess with us. They'd been hiding deeper in the woods, just far enough away to stay hidden from the firelight. They'd been howling, imitating wolves, and laughing at our terrified reactions. We were embarrassed, but honestly, that didn't stop the feeling of unease from creeping up on us. The howls had been real enough, even if they weren't from wolves. The forest still felt strange, and we never really went camping there again. Looking back, I can't help but wonder how they managed to pull it off. Those kids were good, and for a moment, they'd made me believe that wolves might still be out there, lurking just beyond the trees. Even though we knew the truth now, part of me still hears the howls when I close my eyes, wondering if, someday, the wolves will return for real. It was the summer after my sophomore year of high school, and my friend Jess decided that we were all going to camp out in the woods behind her house for her birthday. Jess had this property that bordered a large stretch of wooded land, but most of the time we stayed closer to the house. It was a familiar place, and we had all spent time out there before. But this time we were going further into the woods, away from the house, farther than we had ever ventured. The night had an air of excitement as we packed our bags. Jess had this old, somewhat faded tent that was big enough for all of us. So we decided to take it and set up camp about 1/8 of a mile into the woods. The path we took was familiar, a small dirt trail that ran along the edge of her property, winding through thick trees. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the only light came from the full moon filtering through the canopy of leaves above us. The air was warm, the kind of warm summer evening air that clung to your skin, but there was a slight chill creeping in. We weren't really used to camping, at least not in the way we were about to do it. We didn't have sleeping bags or survival gear. We had a bunch of blankets, a cooler full of snacks, and a couple of flashlights. The idea was to be out there for the night, tell stories, eat too much junk food, and maybe get a little scared. We found a nice little clearing, just big enough for the tent, and started setting up. It didn't take long to get everything in place. The tent wasn't perfect. One of the poles was a little bent from age, but it was functional. After we finished setting up, we built a fire. Jess had packed marshmallows, graham crackers, and chocolate. Camping essentials, right? So, after a few minutes of fiddling with the fire, we had it crackling away, giving us a cozy warmth and casting dancing shadows around us. As the evening went on, we settled into the tent, laughing, joking, and telling ghost stories. It was the kind of night where you feel like the shadows are a little too dark, the rustling of the leaves a little too loud, and every creak of a branch in the wind sounds like something else. As we went around the circle, telling stories, some of us started to get more into it, adding details that made the atmosphere even creepier. Jess had a way of telling stories that made it feel like the hairs on your neck were standing up. But we were all friends and we were safe, right? The fire crackled and popped just outside the tent, casting flickering shadows on the fabric walls. I was sitting at the back of the tent with my back to the corner when I heard something that made my heart skip. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like a low, almost muffled rustling noise, something that didn't quite belong. I brushed it off at first, telling myself it was just the wind or an animal moving around in the woods. After all, the woods behind Jess's house were known for having all sorts of creatures. Deer, coyotes, maybe even the occasional bear. But bear sightings were rare, and they usually stayed farther away from the house. But the sound continued. I started to pay closer attention, and that's when I noticed it wasn't just rustling. It was the sound of something moving around the tent, circling it, making slow, deliberate movements. My stomach dropped. I looked around at the others, trying to gauge if they had noticed too. Some of them were still caught up in the stories, their voices rising with dramatic flair, but I saw a couple of my friends glance nervously toward the sides of the tent. We all knew there was something out there, and the way it moved, it was purposeful, like it was aware of us, like it was watching us. Then, a new sound hit me. It was a sniffing sound, low and heavy, like an animal trying to catch a scent. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold shiver ran through me. The sniffing got closer, and that's when I realized, whatever it wasn't just passing by. It was circling us. It was around the tent, and I had no idea what it was. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, and I glanced at the others. Some of the girls were staring at the walls of the tent, their eyes wide, their mouths frozen in fear. No one was talking anymore. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. I started to panic. My mind was running wild, imagining everything from a bear to something worse. The sniffing continued, loud now, and I could feel it in my bones, like whatever was out there was just waiting for the right moment. I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I dove under the blankets. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I couldn't help it. My heart was pounding in my ears, and the sounds of whatever was circling us grew louder and more intense. I curled up under the blankets, praying that whatever it was would just go away. I could hear the others in the tent, breathing heavily, trying to stay as quiet as possible. We all knew that we had to be silent, that the more noise we made, the more attention we'd draw. Just when I thought I was going to suffocate under the blankets, one of my friends, Rainey, did something that I still can't believe. Rainey was always the bold one, the one who didn't get scared easily. She had this no/T attitude that made her the bravest of us all. Without a second thought, she stood up and unzipped the tent flap. The cold night air rushed in, and I could hear the faint rustling outside. I peeked out from under the blankets, my heart still pounding. I couldn't see what was going on, but I could hear Rainey muttering something under her breath. Then she stepped outside. For a few seconds, I thought I might actually die of fear. My mind raced, imagining every worst-case scenario. Was she out there with a bear? Was it something else? Should we all run? But then, I heard a familiar sound. Rainy's laugh, short and almost a little embarrassed. I dared to peek my head out from under the blankets, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't some wild predator stalking us. It was a dog, specifically the neighbor's Great Dane. It must have wandered off from their house, which wasn't too far from Jess's property, and had heard us. The dog's giant head poked into the tent, his big, wet nose sniffing around, and then he did the last thing I ever expected. He started licking Rainy's face. We all burst out laughing, the tension breaking in an instant. The dog had somehow managed to get lost and wander all the way into the woods, and it seemed like he was just as confused as we were. He stayed with us for the rest of the night, wandering around the campfire, occasionally sniffing at the blankets, and finally curling up near the fire as we all settled down again. We had all been terrified for nothing. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't some dark creature lurking in the shadows. It was just a dog, a big, goofy dog who had gotten lost in the woods. The next morning, we packed up our things and started heading back to Jess's house, the Great Dane following us along the path. We called the neighbors, and they came to pick up the dog. They were surprised but not concerned. It wasn't the first time the dog had wandered off. As we walked back to the house, I could feel the embarrassment creeping in. I had hidden under the blankets like a scared little kid, and I would never live that down. The others teased me relentlessly for the rest of the weekend, calling me the blanket coward every time we made a joke about the night. But despite the teasing, I couldn't help but feel relieved. It had been terrifying, yes, but it was also kind of funny in the end. The night that had started with so much fear had ended with nothing more than a misplaced dog, and I couldn't help but laugh at how ridiculous we all had been. That was the night I learned a few things. 1, never assume the worst without knowing what's out there. 2, sometimes a little bravery is all it takes to make everything less scary. And 3, I will never live down the embarrassment of hiding under the blankets in the middle of the tent. It was late in the evening when my friend Sarah and I pulled up to the cabin. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting the forest around us in deep shadows. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your skin and makes your breath visible. It had been a 3-hour drive from the city, and we were both tired but excited to spend the weekend at the cabin my family owned in northern Michigan. It's not much, just an old mobile home tucked away in the woods, but it had always been a peaceful retreat. Over the years, though, things had started to change. Strange noises in the woods, odd occurrences at the cabin, things that couldn't be explained. When we arrived, it was already dark, and the first thing we noticed was how silent everything was. The usual sounds of the forest seemed to be absent, and even the wind was still. The only noise came from the crunch of our boots on the gravel driveway. I had been to the cabin countless times growing up, and even in the dead of winter, it always felt welcoming. But that night, something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt uneasy. We parked the car and got out, our breath puffing out in clouds of mist. I grabbed the bags and Sarah started looking for the keys. We made our way to the outside electrical box to turn on the power, but the lock was frozen shut. We tried every possible way to get it open, pounding on it with a rock, using the car keys to pry it loose, even kicking it, but nothing worked. The lock wouldn't budge. The cold was biting through our coats, and as the minutes dragged on, I started hearing things from the woods. At first, it was just rustling, faint noises, almost like animals moving through the underbrush. But the longer we struggled with the box, the closer those sounds seemed to get. Sarah looked up at me, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, trying to shake off the sense of dread crawling up my spine. It wasn't unusual to hear wildlife around here. Deer, raccoons, the occasional coyote, but these sounds were different. The crunching of leaves was too heavy for an animal, and the noises were too rhythmic, almost deliberate. I felt a chill run down my spine. "We should go inside," I said, my voice shaky. It wasn't like me to get freaked out over a little noise, but something about this didn't sit right with me. I grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the door of the cabin. We made it inside quickly and locked the door behind us. The cabin was cold and dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the small windows. We tried to keep calm, sitting down in the living room and talking about what to do next. But the longer we sat there, the more unsettled I felt. The noises outside had stopped, but it was the silence that followed that felt even more unnerving. It was the kind of silence that presses down on you, makes you feel like you're being watched. I stood up and went to the window, peering out into the darkness. The trees loomed, their branches swaying with the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. The night felt too still, too heavy. I turned back to Sarah, but before I could say anything, I heard it. 2 sharp knocks on the back door. The sound echoed through the cabin, cutting through the silence like a knife. I froze. Sarah looked at me, her face pale. We both heard it clearly. 2 quick, loud knocks, like someone was standing right outside. My heart raced. My thoughts spun. Who could be out there? We had barely seen another soul in the area for years, let alone anyone out this far at night. Maybe it was just a bear? But why would it knock? Why would it be trying to get in? We sat there in the living room, frozen, our breaths shallow. Every minute felt like an hour. We didn't dare speak, not even a whisper. The knocking came again, louder this time. 2 more sharp raps on the door, as though someone was testing the wood, feeling for a way in. The sound made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced at Sarah, and I could see the fear in her eyes. The thought that someone could be out there, someone who might know we were here and was deliberately messing with us, made my stomach churn. There was something about the way the knocks echoed, so deliberate and controlled, that felt wrong. It wasn't just a random noise. It felt like someone was trying to make us afraid. We waited. The silence after the knocks was worse than the sound itself. Time seemed to stretch, and I couldn't help but feel like I was suffocating. The sound of my own heartbeat was all I could hear. Then, just as I thought the worst was over, there was another sound. A loud bang came from the window. 1 sharp, forceful smack. My heart leaped into my throat, and I couldn't help the scream that almost escaped my mouth. Sarah grabbed my arm, and we both stared at the window. I didn't dare get up and look outside. What if they were waiting for us to make a move? What if they were watching, just waiting for us to show weakness? The knocking continued. 1 more rap on the back door, then silence. And then the bang on the window again. It wasn't a consistent rhythm. It was sporadic, taunting. They would knock on the door, then wait, then bang on the window, over and over again. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. I lost track of time. We just stayed in the living room, every muscle tense, too terrified to sleep, too scared to even move. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was after 2 a.m., and we hadn't heard anything for a while. I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly, and slowly made my way to the door. I didn't want to open it, but I couldn't stand sitting there in the silence anymore. With my hand on the doorknob, I hesitated. Should I check outside? Should I just stay in here and hope that whoever or whatever was out there left? Then the door handle rattled. I froze again. My whole body went rigid, and I felt my heart skip a beat. There was no mistaking it. Someone was trying to get in. Not a knock, not a bang, but the sound of someone physically twisting the door handle, testing it. I didn't think. I just moved. I grabbed Sarah's hand, and we bolted to the far side of the cabin, away from the door. We locked ourselves in the bedroom and pulled the curtains tight, trying to block out any possible view. I could hear the sound of my breathing in the dark room, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. The rest of the night passed in terrified silence, broken only by the occasional banging on the window or door, but the handle never turned again. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we cautiously ventured outside. The air was cold, but the sun was beginning to rise, giving the woods around us an eerie glow. My heart still hadn't stopped racing, but the terror of the night was starting to fade. We made our way to my car, hoping that maybe it would start now that the night was over. But when I popped the hood to check, my breath caught. The bolt that held the metal piece to the battery terminal had been almost completely loosened. It wasn't just a little bit loose. Someone had unscrewed it deliberately. It was hanging by just a few turns, barely attached to the battery. One more twist and it would have fallen off completely. Whoever had been out there the night before had sabotaged the car, just enough to leave us stranded, just enough to make sure we couldn't escape. The weight of what had happened sank in. We weren't dealing with a bear. We weren't dealing with anything natural. Someone had been out there watching us, toying with us, trying to break us down. We don't know who or why, but we knew one thing. They had known exactly what they were doing. I don't know if we'll ever go back to that cabin. Maybe we'll never know the full story of what happened that night. But one thing's for sure. I won't forget the feeling of being trapped, alone in the woods, with no way out. The memory of those knocks, the silence, the feeling of being watched, will stay with me for a long time. We finally managed to get my car started and drove back to town, away from the cabin. We didn't say much on the way out, but we didn't need to. We both knew exactly how lucky we had been to get out of there, and we both knew we would never be coming back. It was always a bit of a surreal experience when we visited my grandfather's second house out in Wilmington, Ohio. For us, growing up in Cincinnati, it felt like stepping into another world every time we made the trip. The house sat on a sprawling plot of land, surrounded by thick, wooded areas and a large pond stocked with fish. The place had that distinct quiet that only rural America can offer. No streetlights, no honking horns, just the occasional rustling of wind in the trees or the croak of frogs at night. It felt like the kind of place you could get lost in, and sometimes we did. My brother and I, being just kids at the time, would spend hours exploring the woods behind the house. We'd pretend we were knights or soldiers, fighting off imaginary enemies with sticks as swords or makeshift guns. It was easy to get lost in the pretend world of adventure out there. We'd wander further and further into the woods, finding new spots, making up stories, and imagining all sorts of creatures hiding just beyond the trees. It was all innocent back then, all about having fun and killing time. But one year, things changed. It was like any other visit. Grandpa had invited us out for a family cookout, and we were looking forward to fishing in the pond again. But this time, as my brother and I wandered into the woods, we noticed something strange. It wasn't like anything we'd seen before. We were used to exploring the woods, but this was different. We found what seemed to be a camp, but not any camp I'd ever seen. There was a table set up, covered with what looked like old, worn-out gear, strange tools, rusted objects, and jars with odd contents that we couldn't quite make out. What stood out the most, though, were the symbols. They were painted on the trees, big, bold, disturbing symbols that looked like something straight out of a horror movie. They didn't look like anything we recognized, just twisted shapes that gave off this uncomfortable vibe. But what really got me was the way they seemed to be all over the place. On the table, on the trees, and even on a tent that was pitched just off to the side. The symbols themselves were grotesque, like something out of a twisted ritual. They didn't look like anything you'd see in a typical camp. There were no friendly, welcoming signs or typical decorations. These were symbols that made your stomach turn when you looked at them for too long. It was like someone had purposely set this camp up to look ominous. And then we saw it, a damn school bus. But it wasn't just sitting there on the ground like any other bus. No, this one was hoisted up into the trees, high, like 30 feet in the air, wedged between two massive oak trees. I still can't figure out how the hell they got it up there. It looked like something out of a nightmare, like whoever set this up was trying to send a message. Or maybe they just liked the idea of having a bus in the trees. I couldn't decide which idea scared me more. The fact that it was there at all, or the possibility that someone had somehow figured out how to make it stay up there. At first, my brother and I stood there in disbelief, trying to figure out what to do. We weren't sure if we should keep exploring or if we'd stumbled upon something we shouldn't be messing with. Part of me wanted to run back to the house and tell Grandpa, but I couldn't bring myself to leave just yet. We walked around the camp, checking out the tent. The symbols painted on the tent matched those on the trees, just as twisted and disturbing. The whole scene felt like it was made to mess with your head, like some kind of sick joke. I remember standing there in front of that tent with my brother. We were both thinking the same thing. Should we go inside? Should we find out what's in there? But neither of us could bring ourselves to do it. That place had an air about it, something that made my skin crawl and my stomach twist. I didn't know if I was more afraid of what was inside the tent or the idea that someone might be watching us from the woods, waiting for us to make a move. After standing there for what felt like forever, we made the decision to leave. We didn't run, but we didn't waste any time either. We turned around and made our way back to the house. The image of that bus still burned into my mind. I didn't even know how to explain what we'd just seen to anyone. It didn't seem real, but it was, and I knew I didn't want to see it again. Grandpa ended up selling the place a few years after that. I don't know why, but I always felt like it had something to do with what we found out there. Maybe he saw something too, or maybe it was just the strange vibe that had started to settle in around the place. I didn't ask him about it. I don't think I wanted to know the answer. We never went back. In the years since, I've wondered if anyone else ever found that camp. Did someone else stumble upon the symbols and the bus in the trees? Was it just some weird prank? Or was there something darker going on there? To this day, I've never seen anything like it, and I don't think I ever want to again. That wasn't the only odd thing about those woods either. There was also a strange little community out there, a shanty town right in the middle of the woods. I don't know how long it had been there or who had built it, but there were these makeshift houses made out of sheet metal and other scrap materials, like someone had just decided to put down roots in the middle of nowhere. The houses weren't even hidden, they were right there in plain sight, just off the trail. Clothes hung out to dry on lines between the trees, and there were other signs of life. Empty cans, discarded tools, things you'd expect to find if someone had set up camp for the long haul. We never got too close to those houses, though. It didn't feel right. Something about them just screamed, "Stay away." It was like someone had been living out there, but we never saw anyone. Maybe that was part of the reason why I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right about that place. It was as if the woods were hiding more than just trees and animals. It was hiding something that didn't belong. One thing that stuck with me from our visits to Grandpa's house was the secret room. Grandpa wasn't one to talk much about the past, but there were things he'd slip into conversation every now and then. One of those things was the hidden room he had behind a movable wall in the bathroom of the house. He always made a joke about it, telling us it was just in case the clan ever comes for me. We'd laugh at the time, but looking back, it was clear he wasn't just making a joke. Grandpa had lived through a lot, and the room was his way of preparing for the worst. I remember sneaking in there a few times, just to see what was inside. It wasn't much, just some supplies, maybe a few old guns, and a couple of things that looked like they'd been sitting in there for decades. It was a strange, unsettling feeling every time I went in there, like I was intruding on something private. But even as a kid, I understood why Grandpa kept it. There was a history to that room, and I don't think I'll ever really understand it fully. Looking back on it all now, I still can't shake the feeling that there was something off about that place. The camp in the woods, the strange bus, the shanty town, and even the hidden room in Grandpa's house. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. I don't know what was going on out there, but I'm not sure I want to know. Whatever it was something that stayed with me long after we left. I've never been back to Wilmington, and part of me wonders if I ever will. In the end, the house got sold, the woods got quieter, and life moved on. But every time I think about those woods, I can't help but wonder if there are still things out there that no one's ever talked about, things that were never meant to be found. For my 7th birthday, my parents decided we should go camping. I don't remember asking for that, but back then I was always just kind of along for the ride with whatever they had planned. I think they thought it would be a fun little adventure, and they probably liked the idea of doing something out in nature instead of throwing a party at the house. They let me bring one of my friends, which helped. I remember being really excited about that part. I don't remember exactly what time of year it was, but I know it was warm enough that we didn't need jackets. and the sun was still hanging around in the evening sky when we pulled into the campsite. It was somewhere in eastern Washington. Couldn't tell you where exactly. I was too young to know directions or care about maps. All I remember is that it was a small, kind of out-of-the-way campsite that seemed like it hadn't been used much recently. The ground was covered in those dry pine needles, the kind that crunch under your shoes and stick to your clothes if you sit down. Big trees all around us, spaced out enough that sunlight came through, but packed tight enough that you couldn't see very far in any direction. There wasn't a real bathroom, just a weird cement outhouse with a door that didn't close all the way. I remember my mom saying it was lucky there was even that. We got there sometime in the afternoon, probably a little before dinner time. I remember being kind of restless in the car ride, just staring out the window and looking at nothing. When we finally pulled in and unpacked the car, I started to get more excited. My friend and I helped set up the tent, which mostly meant we held onto corners of it while my dad hammered in the stakes and grunted a lot. My mom was busy unloading food and camping chairs, and at one point I remember her snapping open a folding table and telling us to stay nearby. Once the tent was up and the sleeping bags were laid out, my mom said we needed to start getting ready to build a fire. It was getting closer to sunset by then, and the air had that kind of orange glow that makes everything feel just a little more alive. The sky was still bright, but the shadows under the trees were growing longer, stretching out on the forest floor like they were trying to grab something. That's probably a dramatic way of describing it, but even as a kid, I remember thinking the woods felt different when the sun started going down. My mom said we needed kindling and small sticks to get the fire going, so we all decided to head into the woods together to gather some. It was me, my friend, my mom, and my dad. We didn't go far, just wandered off the edge of the campsite into the trees where there were more branches on the ground. I remember the feeling of the pine needles under my shoes and the way they made this soft, cushiony crunch. The smell of the trees was strong. Not bad, just sharp. A little dry, a little sticky. I remember the feeling of sticky sap on my fingers when I picked up a broken piece of a branch. The forest was quiet, like really quiet. You could hear a few birds calling out now and then, and there was the occasional snap of a twig under someone's foot. But otherwise, it was just calm. That kind of deep calm you only get in places really far from everything else. No cars, no voices, no humming lights, nothing. I didn't notice it then the way I do now, but that kind of quiet always has a weight to it. Like the silence is something you can touch if you listen hard enough. Now, my mom, she liked to mess with me. She thought it was funny to sneak up behind me and make me jump. I was 7. I was easy to scare, and she already got me at least twice while we were collecting sticks. Once she popped out from behind a tree and made me scream loud enough that even my dad turned around. Another time she tossed a pine cone that hit the ground right next to me, and I just about dropped all the sticks I was holding. She laughed both times, and so did my friend. I tried to laugh too, but it didn't always feel funny. I was a pretty jumpy kid, and the forest already made me a little nervous. Still, I went along with it. I didn't want to seem like a baby, especially not with my friend there. We kept picking up sticks, trying to find dry ones, checking under the trees and near old logs. I started to forget about being scared and focus more on the game of it. Whoever found the biggest pile of kindling would win, that kind of thing. It got darker, but we weren't worried yet. The sun was still up, just low in the sky. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, this sound hit us. It was the loudest sound I'd ever heard in my life. Not the kind of loud that hurts your ears, but the kind that fills up everything. It was like a boom, but not like thunder. It was deeper. It was so loud, but you could still tell it came from far away. Not close enough to feel, but close enough that you knew it was real and big. I froze. My friend did too. My mom and dad both stopped moving. For a second, no one said anything. We just stood there. There was no echo, no follow-up sound, just the single, massive boom and then silence. I was so scared I could feel my legs start to shake. I looked up at my parents, and that's what really got me. They looked worried. Not confused or annoyed, worried. My mom, who just a few minutes ago was tossing pine cones at me and giggling, looked like someone had just grabbed her by the shoulders. My dad had the stiff, alert look on his face, like he was waiting for something else to happen. I think that's when I knew it wasn't a joke. When you're a kid, everything's either fun or pretend. But this didn't feel like pretend. We didn't run or scream or anything like that, but we did head back to the campsite fast. My mom told us to stay close, and I remember her grabbing my shoulder gently and keeping me right next to her. I looked over my shoulder a few times, but there was nothing to see. The trees looked the same. The path looked the same. The shadows were still creeping, but nothing had changed in the way the forest looked. But everything felt different. Back at the campsite, we dumped the sticks near the fire pit. My dad started building the fire right away. He didn't say much, but he kept checking over his shoulder toward the trees. My mom got out the little cooler and started putting out food for dinner. Everything looked normal, but it didn't feel normal anymore. The boom was still in my ears. Not literally, but the memory of it. It was like my body hadn't fully settled down yet. Dinner felt quiet. We roasted hot dogs and marshmallows. My friend and I tried to go back to being silly, but I could tell he was still thinking about it too. My parents kept glancing at each other when they thought we weren't looking. It was subtle, but I noticed. My mom wasn't laughing anymore, and my dad didn't tell his usual dumb camping jokes. That night, when we went into the tent, I had trouble falling asleep. I was tired, but every little noise outside made me flinch. A stick cracking, wind in the branches, even an owl somewhere off in the distance. I kept wondering if the sound would come again, if something was out there, but it didn't. The night went on quietly, and eventually I did fall asleep, probably out of sheer exhaustion. In the morning, everything looked normal again. The sky was bright and blue, the air was crisp, and the birds were out. We ate breakfast and packed up camp. No one talked about the sound, not once. I wanted to ask, but I didn't know how. I think my parents didn't want to scare us more than we already had been. Years later, I asked my mom about that trip. She remembered the boom. She said she and my dad had no idea what it was. They guessed it might have been some kind of military thing, maybe training exercises or a test of something far away. Eastern Washington has some weird remote areas. She said maybe it was a mine blasting or even a sonic boom from a plane, though it didn't quite sound like that. But we never saw anything in the sky. No planes, no smoke, no tremors, nothing. Just the sound. What stuck with me most wasn't just the boom itself, it was how it changed the way everything felt. 1 second we were laughing in the woods, collecting sticks. The next, we were just small people in a big, empty forest with no clue what had just happened. And even though nothing else happened after that, it reminded me for the first time that the world was a lot bigger than I understood. That there were things out there I wouldn't always have answers for. I've gone camping a lot since then. I've heard coyotes yipping in the night, seen bears from a distance, watched lightning storms from inside a tent. But nothing has ever startled me the way that boom did. Not because it was dangerous, because it wasn't. Nothing came of it. But because of how it made me feel. Small, confused, and aware that sometimes, even in the middle of nowhere, something can happen that leaves you with no explanation at all. We never heard the sound again, and I've never figured out what it was. Maybe it really was something simple and distant, but in that moment, to a 7-year-old kid holding a bundle of sticks in the woods, it was the biggest, strangest thing in the world. And that memory's never really gone away. I remember the first camping trip with my boyfriend and our friend. We had decided to do some bike camping in Alaska, a place neither of us had been before. It was one of those trips that started with excitement and curiosity, something you expect to be an adventure. Little did I know it would become one of those trips I would think about when I heard the word danger, but not the kind I was prepared for. The sun was just beginning to set when we set up our hammocks. We were out in the wilderness, surrounded by trees and nothing else. It was quiet, too quiet. Our dog, Lucy, a hyperactive border collie, was sniffing around and darting back and forth between the trees, her energy as wild as the landscape around us. We had the food secured, tied high up in a tree, far enough from our campsite that even a curious bear wouldn't be able to get to it without some serious effort. Or at least that was the plan. Our friend, Jesse, helped me get the food bag tied up, and then we set about settling in for the night. The ground was soft beneath us, and we spent a while laughing, joking, and setting up our hammocks, trying to make everything as comfortable as possible. Lucy wasn't as relaxed, though. She had a way of pacing back and forth when she felt something was off, and tonight she seemed more agitated than usual. She kept glancing into the trees, ears perked up, her tail straight and stiff. It was strange because the forest was still. Nothing but the occasional rustling of branches in the breeze, but Lucy wasn't having it. She wasn't the type to be spooked easily. I was the last one to get into my hammock. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long, haunting shadows across the trail. The light was dimming quickly, and I could hear the wind picking up a little. Jesse and my boyfriend, Aaron, were already lying back in their hammocks, settling into their sleeping bags. I glanced over at Lucy, who had curled up by Aaron's hammock, but her eyes were wide open, scanning the trees. I knew something wasn't right. At first, it was just a feeling, this creeping, anxious sense that something was out there, something we couldn't see. I shook it off, telling myself it was probably just the unfamiliarity of the place. Alaska wasn't like anywhere else we had camped before. The land felt wild, untamed. I thought I was imagining things when I heard a branch snap off in the distance, but that sound was quickly followed by another, and then another. Lucy's ears went up, and she bolted out from under Aaron's hammock, barking frantically. "Lucy, calm down," I called out softly, trying not to alert whatever might be out there to our presence. But it was too late. The smell hit us before we even saw anything. It was unmistakable, the sharp, musky odor of a bear. My heart started to pound in my chest, and the sense of danger rushed in like a tidal wave. I glanced over at Aaron and Jesse, who were both still, their faces frozen with uncertainty. We were still trying to wrap our heads around what was happening when Lucy went into full panic mode, darting toward the tree line, barking loudly. I shot up out of my hammock, my legs shaky, heart racing. That's when we saw them, two black bears, moving cautiously between the trees, sniffing the ground as they came closer to our camp. The bears didn't seem aggressive, but they were definitely interested in something, probably the food we had tied up. They moved slowly, their massive bodies swaying with each step, their black fur blending into the shadows. I could hear the heavy breathing of the bears, the low grunting, the snapping of twigs beneath their paws. It was terrifying how close they were, only a few yards away from where we had set up camp. I grabbed Lucy's leash and pulled her back, my voice shaking as I tried to get her to calm down. But she wasn't having it. She was terrified, growling and whimpering as she tried to pull away from me, desperate to get to the bears. The sounds of their movements, the occasional grunt, and the rustling of leaves were like something out of a nightmare. Jesse was frozen, his eyes wide with fear. Aaron was already up, standing near me, trying to stay calm. "We need to get inside our hammocks," Aaron said quietly, his voice steady but tight with tension. "We need to get away from here." But it wasn't that simple. The bears were too close. The scent of them hung in the air, thick and pungent, and I could feel my chest tightening with each breath. We stayed as still as possible, hoping the bears wouldn't notice us. Lucy was still growling, her body trembling. I could feel her panic, and it made mine worse. We were exposed out in the open. The forest around us seemed to grow darker, more suffocating. It was as if the trees were closing in. The bears lingered for what felt like an eternity. They circled, sniffing, moving in and out of the shadows, their heavy paws leaving prints in the damp earth. Finally, after what felt like forever, they moved off, disappearing into the trees as silently as they had arrived. We stood still for a long time, not daring to make a sound, even after the bears were gone. Once we were sure they weren't coming back, Aaron let out a slow breath. Jesse, too, seemed to relax, though not by much. Lucy, however, was still on edge, her ears flicking at every sound, her eyes darting nervously. We all agreed that it would be better to pack up and leave, at least for the night. We quickly unhooked the food bag from the tree, stuffing everything back into our bags as quickly as we could. The sense of relief when we finally left the campsite and made our way to a nearby trailhead was overwhelming. The feeling of being watched was still heavy on my shoulders. That night, we camped much further away, and I barely slept a wink, listening for any sounds of movement in the dark. It wasn't until the morning, when we were packing up, that I realized how close we had come to disaster. We had been lucky, too lucky. A few years later, I found myself in another camping situation, this time in Oregon. Aaron and I had decided to go bike camping in the Mt. Hood National Forest, a much quieter and more isolated area than I had ever been before. The night had started out peaceful enough. We were the only ones at our campsite, and I was excited for some quiet time in nature. The forest was dense, the air cool and fresh. We had just finished setting up our hammocks when Aaron decided to wander off to smoke, leaving me alone at camp. It wasn't long before I noticed the sounds of other people coming from the direction of a nearby campsite. At first, it seemed harmless enough. A group of guys, about 6 or 7, were drinking and laughing loudly, clearly enjoying their night. They were at the site closest to ours, and I didn't think much of it. But as the night went on, the noise grew louder, and I started to feel uncomfortable. I didn't know why. Maybe it was the fact that they were getting louder, rowdier, or maybe it was just the fact that I was alone. The sound of footsteps approaching broke my thoughts. A voice called out asking if anyone was there. I answered, yes, though my voice felt shaky. That was when they asked if anyone else was there. When I said no, they seemed to get more interested. Suddenly, I didn't feel safe. It wasn't just the alcohol or the noise. It was the fact that they were coming down the trail toward me. I told them not to come closer, but it didn't stop them. It was then that the feeling of danger crept in. They were coming anyway. There were several of them, laughing and joking, their voices growing louder with each step. They were getting closer to my sight. My heart raced. I pulled the flap of my hammock tighter around me, trying to make myself as small as possible, hoping they wouldn't see me, hoping they wouldn't come any closer. Just as they reached the edge of the campsite, Aaron returned. He wasn't aware of what had been going on, but as soon as they saw him, they stopped. They didn't leave right away, though. Instead, they lingered, chatting with him for a few minutes. I stayed in my hammock, trying not to move, trying not to breathe too loudly. I didn't know if they were just clueless, or if they had bad intentions, but at that moment, I felt something in my gut telling me they weren't just drunk guys looking for a good time. They were drunk guys who thought they could intimidate someone who was alone. Eventually, they left, walking back up the trail to their camp. I stayed in my hammock, still too afraid to move. The tension in the air didn't lift until they were well out of earshot. Aaron didn't know what had happened, but he could see something in my face, and he didn't press it. We didn't talk about it much, but the night felt long and uneasy. It wasn't until we packed up and left the next morning that I truly felt the weight of the situation. The fact that something might have happened, but didn't, still stuck with me. We never camped in that area again, and I always felt a little uneasy when I thought about what could have happened that night. We were lucky, but luck wasn't something I was willing to bet on again. Last summer, I went camping near Mammoth, staying in a large tent with my girlfriend and her family. We were set up in a forested area with dozens of other people around, a popular campsite that was almost always full during the summer months. The noise of chatter and laughter carried in the air, punctuated by the crackling of campfires and the occasional distant sound of kids running around. Despite the busy nature of the camp, there was a certain calm in the air, and I had been looking forward to a relaxing getaway. We were surrounded by towering pines, their needles rustling in the breeze. The campsite itself was packed with people, tents, RVs, and picnic tables scattered everywhere. It wasn't exactly secluded, but it felt far enough removed from the hustle and bustle of town. The nights were quiet, with only the occasional whisper of the wind and the faint hum of distant conversations. That's what made what happened one night all the more terrifying. The first sign that something was wrong came late in the night, after everyone had settled into their tents for the evening. I remember lying there in my sleeping bag, trying to drift off, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. It was a typical summer night, cool with just the faintest hint of dampness in the air. I had just started to doze off when suddenly, I heard a loud thud, followed by a deep, guttural roar. It was a sound I had never heard before, so unnatural, like the earth itself had been disturbed. It rattled me, even as I tried to convince myself that I was just dreaming. But then I heard it again, the low growl rumbling through the air, and that's when the panic set in. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if I was still dreaming or not. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the adrenaline starting to kick in, making my body tense with fear. I sat up in the dark, straining my ears for more sounds. The roar sounded closer now, and I could hear something moving around the campsite, heavy steps crunching the underbrush. I wasn't alone. My girlfriend shifted beside me, clearly awake too, and I could hear her breathing sharply. She looked at me, her eyes wide with confusion, but I couldn't speak. I could feel something was off, and then I heard it again. A loud crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large rummaging through our camp. I knew then that whatever it wasn't just a wild animal. It was something bigger, something with a purpose. I whispered to her, my voice barely a breath, "It's a bear." Her face paled, and she froze, straining her ears. I could feel the air in the tent getting colder, and for a split second, I thought I could hear the sound of the bear sniffing the plastic crate of food we had left out by the edge of the site. We had been careless that night, leaving a large black plastic food container just outside the tent, thinking it would be fine. It wasn't the first time we'd camped near wildlife, and while we knew there were bears in the area, I don't think we truly realized just how close they could come until that moment. Then, the bear made another move, its claws scraping against the plastic, and that's when I heard the unmistakable tearing sound. It was so loud, the bear was digging into the crate like it was made of paper. I could hear it ripping apart the box, breaking through the heavy plastic like it was nothing. The bear was relentless, trying to get to whatever food was inside. I looked at my girlfriend, her face a mix of fear and disbelief. In the dark, I could make out the outline of a massive creature, its body low to the ground, the faint shine of its eyes catching the reflection of the moonlight. I remember feeling a surge of terror at how close it was. If it wanted to, it could easily rip through our tent and get to us. My mind raced as I thought about what to do. I knew we were supposed to stay calm, but that wasn't happening. I could hear the bear moving, its breath heavy and ragged, still going at the crate. Finally, the noise stopped. The bear had taken what it wanted and moved off. The silence that followed was deafening. I barely dared to breathe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I didn't sleep a wink that night, just lying there, listening for the bear to return. The next morning, we were all shaken. The bear had managed to break into the plastic crate and had taken a big chunk of the food. We quickly realized that we'd made a huge mistake leaving the food out. But what made it worse was how easily the bear had gotten through. The thought that it had come that close to us, just a few feet away, sent chills down my spine. That day, we made sure to move everything into the car, hoping it would deter the bear from coming back. We locked up the food, put away all the trash, and even placed the cooler inside the car to be extra cautious. But despite our precautions, we couldn't shake the feeling that the bear was still out there, watching us. That night, we tried to sleep, but every sound in the woods had us on edge. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the trees made me jump. Around midnight, I heard it again, a loud thud, followed by that same deep, rumbling roar. The bear had returned. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, unable to move, unable to speak. I could hear it moving around again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just rummaging through our stuff. I could hear the bear getting closer to the tent. My heart pounded as I realized how close it was to us. My girlfriend was awake now too, holding onto me tightly, her grip almost painful. We didn't make a sound, too afraid to move, too afraid to even breathe. Suddenly, there was another noise. This time, it was the sound of tearing fabric. The bear was trying to get into the tent. It wasn't just rummaging through our food. It was tearing into the fabric of the tent, trying to find a way in. The panic I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I wanted to run, but I knew I couldn't. I had to protect her to keep us both safe. Then, a loud noise rang out, the sound of the car alarm blaring through the night. We had set it off in a desperate attempt to scare the bear away. It worked. The bear hesitated for a moment, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it bolted off into the woods. The next day, we were all rattled, our nerves still raw from the previous night. Some of the other families who had been camping with us were so scared that they decided to leave early, even renting hotel rooms for the rest of the trip. Couldn't blame them. I was scared too. I don't think any of us slept well after that. The following night, we were more prepared. We put all of our food, our coolers, and anything else that might attract the bear into the car. We kept the windows rolled up tight and locked the doors, hoping that would be enough to keep the bear at bay. But the bear came back. This time, we saw it from a distance. It had climbed to the top of a nearby hill, just beyond the reach of the campfire light, and it was watching us. We shone a flashlight in its direction, and the only thing we could see were two glowing eyes staring back at us from the dark. It didn't move. It just sat there, watching. I'll never forget those eyes. They were cold, unblinking, and full of something I couldn't quite identify. It was as if the bear was studying us, figuring out whether or not to come closer. But after a while, it simply turned and disappeared back into the trees. We didn't sleep that night. None of us did. We stayed awake, listening to every crack of a branch, every gust of wind. We knew the bear was out there, but for some reason it didn't come back. It had seemed to lose interest, but the fear never really left. The next morning, we packed up our things, ready to leave. We were all exhausted, emotionally drained from the constant fear. As we drove out of the campsite, I glanced back one last time at the woods. I knew the bear was still out there, but at least we were leaving. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been lucky, that we had narrowly avoided something far worse. That trip was a reminder of how unpredictable nature can be, how even when you think you're safe, something as simple as a black bear can turn a peaceful camping trip into a fight for survival. It was late fall when my friend and I decided to take a camping trip up to Mount Mitchell, hoping to get one last good adventure before winter fully set in. We had both been looking for an escape, a break from the constant grind of work and responsibilities. The cold, crisp air seemed like a perfect backdrop for a getaway in the mountains. The trailhead was at the foot of the mountain, and as we pulled up, the first thing that caught my eye was a weathered sign that warned us to watch out for bobcats. We chuckled at it. Bobcats, really? I figured the warning was a formality. Sure, they lived around here, but the idea of encountering one in the wild seemed so far-fetched, especially during the day when we would be on the trail. Still, it was a reminder that the wilderness had its own rules, its own dangers. We grabbed our packs and started down the trail, the soft crunch of fallen leaves beneath our boots the only sound that accompanied our conversation. The trees here were starting to turn, vibrant colors of orange and yellow clinging to the branches as we hiked deeper into the woods. After a few miles, we found a decent spot to set up camp. It was getting late, and the daylight was rapidly fading. The air had already started to turn cold, nipping at our skin as we tried to gather some firewood. But it hadn't rained the night before, and everything was damp. The twigs, the branches, everything was soaked. We fiddled with the fire for a while, desperately trying to get some flame, but nothing worked. After what felt like an eternity, we had to admit defeat. We weren't going to have a fire tonight. As the sun set behind the mountains, the chill really started to sink in. We strung up our hammocks between two sturdy trees, hoping the shelter of the hammocks would keep the wind from cutting through us. The space between the hammocks was tight, but we managed to fit in with the extra layers we had brought. I piled on a fleece jacket, my winter coat, and a pair of thick socks, but the cold still crept in. Even the warmth of the space blanket didn't seem to help much. I remember thinking how unprepared we'd been. Who knew it would get this cold this quickly? After about an hour of tossing and turning, trying to get comfortable in the hammock, my friend called out to me from the distance, his voice muffled by the cold. "Are you cold?" "Freezing my tits off," I shouted back. not even bothering to whisper. There was no one around to hear us. We had been stupid not to bring something more substantial, like a better sleeping bag. We'd figured we could handle it, but now we were paying the price. Both of us were shivering. Despite our best efforts to cuddle up and use each other's body heat, it wasn't working. The cold had set in, and it didn't seem to care how tightly we tried to huddle together. We spent another 20 minutes trying to fall asleep, but every time we shifted in the hammock, the chill seemed to get worse. Finally, we gave up. "Let's just head back to the car," my friend suggested. "It's only a few miles. We can make it." I hesitated at first. It wasn't the most logical idea, but I didn't want to spend another minute freezing. So we pulled ourselves out of the hammocks, packed up what little gear we had, and began the hike back to the car. Our headlamps barely cut through the darkness, casting long, narrow beams in front of us. The air was even colder now, and every step felt like it took a little more out of us. But we kept moving, one foot in front of the other, pushing through the exhaustion. We were about halfway back when we saw it. Two glowing eyes in the distance, low to the ground, about a foot off the trail. They shone in the dark, reflecting the light from our headlamps. For a moment, I thought it was a bobcat, just like the sign had warned us about. The warning flashed in my mind, "Watch out for bobcats." And my heart rate picked up. The eyes didn't move, just stared at us from the underbrush. We stopped dead in our tracks, the air suddenly thick with tension. "What is that?" my friend whispered, his voice low. "I think it's a bobcat," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could feel the adrenaline already pumping through my veins. "We need to get moving." But as we stood there, looking at the glowing eyes, I realized they weren't moving. They were just sitting there, unblinking, almost as if waiting. I could hear my own breathing getting louder as the fear built up in me. We couldn't just walk by it. There was no way we could ignore it. The sign had mentioned bobcats, but nothing said anything about them being passive or about their behavior. For all we knew, this one might be territorial or worse, hungry. My mind raced. "We need to scare it off," I said, my voice shaking with more fear than I wanted to admit. "Now." We both reached for our bear whistles and blew them hard, the shrill sound filling the cold air. We screamed as loud as we could, hoping to make ourselves as big and intimidating as possible. Every instinct told me to run, but I knew that would only make us targets. We had to stand our ground. The creature didn't move. It didn't flinch, didn't turn away. Stood its ground, frozen, unmoving. We were getting closer now, and the anxiety was gnawing at me with every step. What if it wasn't a bobcat? What if it was something else? Something bigger? As we neared the spot, I could see more clearly. The eyes were lower than I expected, closer to the ground than the eyes of a cat should have been. The silhouette started to become clearer. It was too small for a bobcat. My heart skipped a beat as I realized what we were actually looking at. It was a dog, a small dog, sitting quietly on the side of the trail. It was completely calm, looking back at us with an almost disinterested gaze. My panic dissolved instantly, but a strange wave of embarrassment washed over me. All that noise, all that adrenaline, for nothing. "Is that a dog?" my friend asked, his voice filled with a mix of confusion and relief. "Looks like it," I muttered, still in disbelief. We stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. The little dog didn't seem to care about us at all. It was just sitting there, as if waiting for something. I could hear the faint sound of rustling nearby. Tent, I realized. The dog must have been outside someone's tent. I suddenly felt stupid for blowing the bear whistle and acting like we were about to face down some wild animal. We took a few cautious steps closer, and I could hear the soft murmur of voices from the tent, followed by a muffled, sleepy-sounding shout. "Shut up, Rusty," came a voice from inside the tent. "Go back to bed." The little dog gave us one last curious glance before trotting back toward the tent. We watched for a moment, then turned away and continued our hike back. The adrenaline still hummed in my veins, but now it felt almost ridiculous. We'd been ready to fight off a bobcat for a dog. I laughed a little, the tension finally starting to drain from my body. By the time we reached the car, we were exhausted and ready to get out of the cold. The warmth inside the car was a relief, but the laughter kept coming. We sat there for a while, recovering from the panic. The moment was too strange not to laugh about it. That night, we drove back down the mountain in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Eventually, we talked about it, how we had convinced ourselves we were about to face down a wild animal, how the adrenaline made everything seem so much more dangerous than it really was. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of how close we had come to making a mistake. It was a lesson, I suppose, about fear, about how the wilderness could mess with your mind, how the dark could make even the most innocent things seem dangerous. I glanced back at the mountain as we left, a place that had tried to rattle us in ways we didn't expect. It was cold, yes, but it was also beautiful in its own way. And as the headlights swept over the road ahead, I felt a strange sense of accomplishment, as though I had faced something bigger than the mountain itself, my own fear. I was about 10 years old the summer it happened. My family had been camping at this spot for a few days now, one of those big campgrounds that stretched for miles, with cabins scattered between the trees and small tents pitched around a central campfire pit. It wasn't exactly deep wilderness, but it felt like it when you were in the thick of it, surrounded by nothing but trees and the occasional distant chatter of other campers. My younger brother and sister were playing by the creek, tossing rocks and pretending they were explorers. My parents were somewhere nearby, probably tending to the fire or gathering wood for the night. As a 10-year-old, I was desperate to explore and find something new, something exciting, something other than sitting around and listening to the same stories. It was the kind of carefree moment that felt infinite. That's when I met him, another boy around my age. He was the kind of kid who wasn't shy, who immediately waved me over with a big grin on his face. He had messy brown hair, like mine, and was wearing an old, faded red t-shirt and shorts that came down just above his knees. His name was Jake. I don't remember much about how we started talking, but soon enough, we were running through the trees together, laughing, darting in and out of the woods, looking for mischief, or maybe just some adventure. We ran for what felt like hours, weaving between the towering trees and the uneven ground. The whole area smelled like pine and dirt, with the occasional sharp scent of wet leaves. We finally emerged at the edge of the campground, where it met a line of parked RVs and campers, scattered in the quiet, gravel-covered lot. As we walked past the first group of campers, we noticed something odd. It was two older couples, sitting outside near a camper, laughing, talking, until we saw her. A girl, maybe a few years older than us. She was sitting on one of the guys' laps, completely naked, her back arched slightly as if trying to be comfortable, but looking very much out of place. The girl had long, dark hair that hung loosely around her shoulders. She wasn't facing us directly at first, but when she saw us, she stopped whatever she was doing and started walking toward us, stepping on her tiptoes, almost as if she was trying to be quiet or sneaky. Her movements were unnatural, almost stiff, like a baby deer trying to walk for the first time. It didn't make any sense. Jake and I froze for a second, not sure if we were supposed to keep walking or if we should stop. We had never seen anything like that before. The way she moved, the way she looked at us was unsettling. There was something about her expression, something I couldn't put into words, but it made me feel like I had just stepped into something I wasn't supposed to see. We kept walking, though, not really sure what to do with the confusion and unease building in our stomachs. 10 steps, that's all it took. The parking arrangement made it so that once we passed the RVs, we couldn't see them anymore, but we still felt that sense of being watched. Once we were out of sight, we turned to each other, exchanging wide-eyed glances. Without saying anything, we both knew what we'd just seen wasn't normal, felt wrong. I don't even know why we did it, but curiosity got the better of us. We turned back around, slowly, and peeked over our shoulders to look again. In those few moments, something had shifted. The girl was gone, but the adults weren't acting normal either. The one man who hadn't been sitting with her stood up. His face, before it had been relaxed, now looked hard and angry. He walked quickly, almost purposefully, toward where we were standing. I don't know if it was the way his eyes narrowed or the way his jaw clenched, but it hit me then. Something was wrong. We were in danger. Jake's hand shot out, grabbing my arm, pulling me. We didn't think, didn't plan, we just ran. We didn't stop running until we were back at the far end of the campground, near the creek where my younger siblings were. We didn't even look back. We didn't need to. We could feel it, that weight of something closing in. Something bad was happening, but neither of us had the words to explain it. We stayed by the creek for a while, pretending nothing had happened, pretending we hadn't just witnessed something we couldn't even begin to understand. But I couldn't shake the image of the girl from my mind, or the look on that man's face. My stomach turned every time I thought about it. We didn't tell anyone, not at first. We both knew what we'd seen wasn't something we could easily explain, not to our parents or the other kids at camp. The rest of the night was a blur. I don't remember eating dinner or what we talked about around the campfire, or if my parents even asked where I'd been. All I could think about was the girl, and the man walking toward us, and the terrible feeling in my gut. Later, in the dark, as I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to fall asleep, I kept hearing sounds from the woods, twigs snapping, the rustling of leaves. I kept telling myself it was just animals, that it was nothing, but that image of her walking toward us, and the man's angry face wouldn't go away. Every noise in the dark seemed to send my heart racing again. I wasn't sure if I was scared of what we had seen, or what might happen next. That night, we didn't talk. The next morning, Jake and I shared a look, but didn't speak about what had happened. The girl, the man, and the whole strange scene seemed to have vanished overnight. I don't know if I imagined it, or if I had just been too naive to understand what was going on, but that morning felt like a veil had been pulled over the entire campground. The adults acted like nothing had happened, like everything was perfectly normal, but I could still feel that wrongness lingering in the background. Over the years, the memory didn't fade. Every now and then, I'd think about that trip, about that girl, the look in her eyes, the man who had walked toward us, the sense of danger that had chased us into the woods. Even as I grew older, I couldn't shake it. I thought about it yesterday, in fact. It hit me all over again. The girl never left my mind. I wondered where she was, what had happened to her. Had she been forced into that situation? Was she even safe? What did those men want with her? I still don't know. 30 years have passed, but I can still see her walking toward us, stiff and awkward. The man's face twisted in anger, the feeling in my gut that something was terribly wrong. I wish I had known what to do. I wish I had spoken up, but I was just a kid. And even now, I don't know if I would have known how to make it right. There are no neat answers, no easy solutions. But I will never forget that trip, or that feeling of something being wrong. Something beyond our understanding. Something that we should have never witnessed. And every time I think about it, I wish I had run faster. It was one of those typical Australian weekends, the kind where the heat of the sun stretches lazily across the land, and you can feel the dry earth beneath your feet. My parents and I had decided to go camping for a few days, as we had a little break and no particular place to be. We didn't plan anything grand, just a bit of time in the bush, swimming in a secluded waterhole, and maybe a bit of fishing, as we usually did on those sorts of trips. It was supposed to be one of those peaceful, relaxing getaways where the hardest decision you'd make was whether to take a swim in the morning or after lunch. We had heard about this waterhole from some locals who said it was a perfect spot for a swim. It wasn't far from where we lived, maybe an hour or so by car, but it felt completely isolated, tucked away deep in the bush. When we first arrived, there was nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees, the occasional call of a bird, and the distant buzz of insects. The place seemed untouched, wild, and for some reason, that made it feel even more serene. It was a wide, open area around the waterhole. The water itself was clear, shimmering in the sunlight, surrounded by thick reeds and trees on all sides. The kind of place where you could easily lose track of time. We set up camp near the water's edge, spreading out a blanket and unpacking our picnic. My parents were content, chatting about nothing in particular as I ran around, eager to jump into the cool water. I spent a lot of time swimming, diving, and just enjoying the peace of the spot. Looking back now, I can't help but think how calm everything seemed. It was one of those days when everything feels perfect, too perfect. It was the kind of day you wish you could bottle up and keep forever. The heat of the day, the shade of the trees, the cool, fresh water that you could never find in the city. Everything just felt right. My parents seemed just as content as I was, both of them talking about the usual things parents talk about when they're away from the pressures of daily life. Plans for the future, a little bit about work, and how we should come here more often. It was calm, almost unnervingly so. We were just enjoying ourselves. But what we didn't know then was that we had been swimming in the heart of danger the entire time. After a while, my dad and I went for a walk around the area, not far from where the camp was set up. We were just exploring, enjoying the quiet. It didn't feel like there was anything that could go wrong. The sun was still high, and it felt almost too warm to think that anything could be dangerous. We walked along the path, crunching dry leaves underfoot, talking about this and that. As we walked, we came upon a small, weathered sign that had been half hidden by overgrown grass. It wasn't immediately noticeable, but something about it caught my dad's eye. He walked over to it, and I followed, not really thinking anything of it. It was an odd sign, faded and hard to read, but the words that were visible stopped him in his tracks. "Saltwater crocodiles," he muttered under his breath, his face going a little pale as he scanned the rest of the sign. The rest of the text was too worn to read, but that part stood out clearly. My stomach twisted as I saw the look on his face. We'd both heard of saltwater crocs before, of course. They were infamous in parts of Australia, but I had never expected to see one so close, let alone in a place where we were swimming just a few hours before. "Dad, what's this?" I asked, my voice quieter than usual. I could sense something was off. He was already walking back towards the waterhole, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "I don't know. It doesn't make sense. This spot is too far from the usual croc territory. It's too isolated." His voice trailed off, and there was a nervous edge to it now. We didn't immediately pack up and leave, not right away. I think we both wanted to believe that maybe it was just an old sign, or maybe there had been an accident years ago that caused someone to put it up and forget about it. But the more we thought about it, the more uneasy we became. We walked back to camp, both of us silent now. My mom was sitting by the fire, flipping through a book, oblivious to the tension that had just been planted. My dad looked at her, then looked back at me. His face had changed completely, and I could see the worry starting to creep in. "Let's pack up," he said quietly, his voice a little too calm. "It's time to head back." At first, my mom didn't understand. She didn't know what had happened with the sign, so she just assumed we were ready to go home for the day. But there was something in my dad's voice that made her stop asking questions, and she started packing up with no protest. I didn't understand everything at that moment, but I could feel that something had shifted. We didn't waste time getting everything packed. My dad's pace quickened as he worked, his movements sharp and urgent, as if he was racing against something. I helped as best I could, but I noticed that even as we finished loading up the car, my dad kept glancing around, scanning the treeline, looking over the waterhole as though expecting something to emerge from the shadows. It was then that I began to feel the weight of what we had missed. The drive back to town was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My dad's eyes never seemed to leave the road for long, and I could feel the tension in the car, even though my mom was none the wiser. She kept talking, asking if we had enjoyed the trip, but there was no answer from either of us. As we got closer to the main road, my dad's grip on the wheel loosened, and I noticed him breathing a little easier. But it wasn't until we reached a petrol station about a mile or so from the campsite that everything became clear. He pulled the car over, and that's when he picked up a small, crumpled brochure from the seat next to him. It had a picture of a saltwater crocodile on the front, and inside it listed the exact waterhole we had visited that day as one of the most infested spots in the region. I still remember the exact words on the page. "This area is prohibited for public access without a permit. Saltwater crocodile populations in this area are dense, and unauthorized entry can result in serious injury or death. Permits are only granted to those with appropriate training and experience." It hit us both at the same time. We had been swimming in a waterhole that was teeming with crocs, and we hadn't even known it. The idea of it made my stomach turn. How many times had I been in that water, blissfully unaware of the danger? How close had we come to a close encounter with something that could have torn us apart without a second thought? We left that area shaken, our heads spinning with the realization that what we thought had been a perfect trip could have been our last. There was no sign of the crocodiles, no visible threat, and yet, there could have been one lurking beneath the surface the entire time. That peaceful, untouched place was the kind of setting that hides its dangers well, making it all the more terrifying. That night, as we lay in bed, the sound of the Australian night around us felt different, sharper. I couldn't stop thinking about the waterhole, about the hidden creatures just under the surface, waiting for their next opportunity. I knew I would never see a peaceful waterhole the same way again. Not after what we had learned. We had been so close to something we didn't understand, and it was only luck that had kept us safe. It was July 2016, and I was out camping in one of my favorite places, Moraine Lake, just below South Sister in Central Oregon. I had been here before, but this time I had my 2 dogs with me. Lily, my 3-year-old standard poodle, and Blue, my 4-month-old Heeler Aussie mix. They were both my buddies, and I'd brought them along for the adventure, hoping they could handle the trek up South Sister with me the next day. I had summited the mountain before, but I wanted to get a couple of miles in that evening to get a good start for the climb the next morning. Setting up camp wasn't too difficult. I knew the area well and had picked a flat spot near some trees for shelter. The sun was beginning to set, and I was feeling pretty good about things. The dogs were already sniffing around, checking out the area while I made sure our tent was secure. I tied up all the food stuff, including my dog's food, to a tree branch about 150 yards away, well away from the camp. I'd learned long ago to take extra precautions with food storage. Bears weren't something I wanted to deal with, especially in the middle of the night. It wasn't long before I got the fire going, and we all settled in. The air was cool, and the night sounds of the woods slowly started to fade as I lay back in my sleeping bag, my dogs curled up on either side of me. The stars were clear in the sky, and everything seemed perfect. It was exactly the kind of peaceful evening I had hoped for when I set out on this trip. The only noise was the occasional crackle of the fire and the gentle rustling of the trees in the breeze. But that peace didn't last long. I had just about fallen asleep when it happened. A bark. A sharp, sudden bark. It was Lily, and her bark was panicked, louder than I'd ever heard it before. She was standing up in her sleeping bag and started pacing around, looking in the direction of the tree line. I could hear her low growls, and she kept her eyes locked on something I couldn't see. I turned over to check on Blue, but he was still curled up next to me, completely silent, which I found strange. He usually barked when Lily did, but now he was unusually calm, almost too calm. I could feel the tension rising in the air, and something in my gut told me that whatever was out there wasn't something to ignore. Lily barked again, and this time I sat up, fully awake, my heart racing. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the tree line, but all I could see were shadows. The forest was thick with trees and underbrush, and there was no way to see anything clearly. I scanned the area, listening intently for any movement, but all I could hear was the sound of Lily's barking echoing in the dark. Then I heard it, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush, the thud of heavy footsteps. It wasn't like the usual quiet rustling of deer or smaller animals. This was different, too heavy, too deliberate. My first thought was that it was a bear, but there was no way. My food was far enough away, hanging safely from the tree. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was big, bigger than I wanted to deal with. I whispered to Lily, trying to calm her down, but she was having none of it. She was on high alert, growling softly as she moved around the tent, clearly trying to get a better look at whatever was out there. Blue, on the other hand, stayed perfectly still, his head tucked between his paws, his eyes wide open but not making a sound. It was like he knew something I didn't. The noise outside grew louder, and I could hear the heavy breathing of whatever it was, mixed with the crunching of leaves and branches as it moved around the camp. I could feel the ground vibrating slightly with each step it took. I knew then that this was no deer, and definitely not a smaller animal. This thing was huge. My mind raced through all the possibilities, trying to figure out what the hell could be out there. I grabbed my Glock from the side of the tent, keeping it low and close to my chest. I wasn't someone who went looking for trouble, but I wasn't about to be caught off guard either. I hated the thought of having to use it, but I'd rather be prepared than regret not having it. The last thing I wanted was to harm an animal in its home, but if this thing decided to get too close, I'd have to act. I sat there in the dark, trying to stay as quiet as possible, my breath shallow, barely moving. Lily's barking had stopped for a moment, and I could only hear the heavy footsteps circling around my tent. I focused on my breathing, listening to every crack and pop from the trees, trying to get a sense of where this thing was. It wasn't moving like a typical animal. It wasn't just passing by. It was circling, pacing, almost like it was stalking the area. The sound was constant, like it was right there, just outside the tent. It wasn't close enough to make me think it was about to charge, but it was close enough to make my heart pound in my chest. My mind kept racing, trying to figure out what the hell this was. A bear? A moose? The footsteps didn't sound quite right for either of those. It was too heavy, too deliberate. I had no idea what it could be, but I had no intention of finding out by getting too close. I kept my dogs as calm as I could, petting them, whispering to them in a soft, steady voice. Blue was still perfectly still, his eyes darting around, trying to make sense of what was happening. Lily, however, was on edge, her body tense, and I could feel her muscles twitching every time she heard a footstep outside. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. I sat there, frozen, not daring to make a move, not knowing what to do. All I could hear was the sound of the thing pacing around, its footsteps growing fainter, then louder again. I didn't know if it was getting closer or moving farther away, but it was enough to keep me on edge. Around 4 a.m., the sound suddenly stopped, just like that, complete silence. It was so abrupt, I wondered if I had imagined it. But then I heard something else, the faint rustle of leaves. The thing was still out there, but now it was moving away from me. I held my breath, straining to hear it, and I realized it was walking off, fading into the distance. The heavy footsteps were growing quieter with each passing second until they disappeared entirely. I waited for what felt like an eternity, not daring to move. My hands were trembling as I lowered my Glock, the tension in my chest still high, but the fear starting to subside. The silence stretched on for several minutes before I finally dared to let out a breath. Whatever it was, it had left. I spent the next hour wide awake, listening for any sign that it might return, but the night remained eerily quiet. It was only when the first light of dawn began to break through the trees that I finally allowed myself to relax, even just a little. I checked the camp and found no sign of any tracks. Nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to indicate what had been circling around me for hours. It was like whatever it was had vanished without a trace. By the time the sun was fully up, I was exhausted, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. I packed up my gear and made sure the dogs were ready to go. We still had the summit to climb, and I wasn't about to let some strange encounter ruin the rest of my trip. Despite everything that had happened the night before, the day was beautiful, and the summit of South Sister was every bit as stunning as I remembered. The whole experience was unsettling, but ultimately, I was grateful nothing worse happened. Sometimes nature throws curveballs at you, and you can't predict what'll happen out there. You can only prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And in the end, I made it to the top, with Lily and Blue by my side, and it was a moment I'll never forget. A little shaken, but grateful for the adventure. I was about 16 at the time when this all happened, and I spent a lot of my summers at my best friend's house. It was on a little dead-end dirt road outside of a tiny town. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. His parents had a small house on a few acres of land, most of which was surrounded by thick woods. We were used to wandering out there, exploring the trails and pretending we were lost in some wild adventure. There was something oddly peaceful about being out there in the woods, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves or the occasional bird call. But there was something unsettling about it too, something that we couldn't quite put our finger on. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, and the feeling of being watched was never too far off, even though we never actually saw anything. It was just a sense, an intuition that someone or something might be out there, hidden, waiting. The whole area had this quiet, almost oppressive feel to it. But as kids, we didn't let that stop us. A half-mile down the road from my friend's house lived an old man. He was known as the guy who grew ginseng for a living. His land was all secluded and off the beaten path, which made it even more mysterious. I don't think anyone really knew much about him. Other than that, he kept to himself and didn't talk to people much. There was a lot of talk about him, though, some rumors floating around. People said he didn't like anyone near his property, and the ginseng was his livelihood. He didn't want anyone messing with it, and if you did, well, you were asking for trouble. One summer, when I was around 16, something happened that made everyone in our small town talk. Something that made me realize just how dark things could get out there. It was Bobby Joe, a guy I barely knew, but I'd seen around. He was a few years older than me, and there were rumors about him and his bad decisions. He wasn't exactly the kind of guy who got along with people. The whole town seemed to know about his run-ins with the law and his shady dealings, but no one really paid him much attention until he went missing. Bobby Joe had been last seen walking down the road where his mom dropped him off. That's it. No one had any idea where he went after that. The story was that he'd been up to something with that old man's ginseng. They said Bobby had been trying to steal the plants and had run off into the woods, but no one really knew the truth. It was just gossip, but it was enough to make people nervous. It was the kind of thing that made you start second-guessing what was really going on out there, what was hidden in the shadows of the trees. Of course, me and my friend, being the typical teenagers that we were, decided to go investigate. We figured we'd go up into the woods, follow the trail, and see if we could find any clues about where Bobby Joe might have gone. Looking back now, I realize how stupid we were, but at the time, it just seemed like another way to pass the time. We figured it'd be an adventure. It wasn't the first time we'd wandered into those woods, but this time felt different. The trail we usually walked on was about a 20-minute hike from my friend's house. It was a path we knew well. It wound through dense trees, and there were old, forgotten stumps and rocks scattered along the way, remnants of what must have been a more carefully tended area years ago. As we walked, we joked and talked about nothing in particular, the kind of mindless chatter that comes naturally when you're with your best friend. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was quiet, unnaturally so. No birds, no wind in the trees, just the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot. We kept walking, though. We had nothing better to do. We were used to these woods, or so we thought. Then we heard it. It was a man's voice, calling for help, distant but clear, like someone was in trouble. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I looked at my friend, and I could see the confusion on his face too. We both froze, standing still on the trail, straining to hear. The voice came again, louder this time. It was unmistakable. A man was yelling for help. I looked at my friend, and he looked at me, and we both stood there for what felt like forever. Neither of us moved. Neither of us said anything. It was like time had stopped. We couldn't figure out what to do. The voice continued to call out, getting more frantic, more desperate. "Help! Help me!" It echoed through the trees, the sound growing louder, but no closer. After what seemed like an eternity, we both turned and ran. There was no discussion, no plan. We just ran. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I don't know why we didn't stop to figure out where the voice was coming from, why we didn't try to help. I think we were too scared, too confused by what we were hearing to do anything rational. We ran as fast as we could, all the way back down the trail, back to my friend's house. When we finally made it back, we were out of breath, our legs burning from the sprint. We didn't say much, just kind of stood there for a minute, trying to catch our breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My friend's parents were inside, and we didn't want to scare them, so we didn't tell anyone right away. We just tried to shake it off. But that voice, it kept echoing in my head. The next day, the town was buzzing with news. They found Bobby Joe's body, buried on the old man's property. The story was that he had been shot twice, and his arm had been ripped off. They said his body had been moved, but no one knew why or how long he'd been there. The old man, the one who grew ginseng, was arrested. Turned out he hadn't told the police the whole story right away. He claimed Bobby Joe had been trying to steal his ginseng, and in the heat of the moment, things had gone wrong. The old man shot him in self-defense, he said. But the story didn't add up. Why bury him on the property? Why didn't he come forward sooner? Why not call the police immediately? As it turned out, the old man didn't spend much time in jail. They didn't have enough evidence to charge him with murder. It was all so messed up. The town was in shock. People started locking their doors more often, keeping their distance from that part of the woods. It wasn't just the old man anymore. It was the whole place. People began to think there was something cursed about that land, something dark and hidden in the trees. I couldn't stop thinking about that voice, the way it had called out to us. It still haunted me, the way it echoed in my head, the way we just ran without thinking, the way we never stopped to figure out who or what was in trouble out there. Was it Bobby Joe, calling for help from the woods? Was he already gone by the time we heard it? Or had he been out there, still alive, still trying to get help? I'll never know, and that's the worst part. We never went back to those woods. I don't think I ever could. The memory of that day, of hearing the voice, of running back in fear, will stay with me for the rest of my life. The woods aren't a place for adventure anymore. They're a place where people go missing, where things happen in the dark that you can't explain. And I'll never forget the feeling of standing there, frozen, listening to that voice, and knowing that I couldn't help. In the end, Bobby Joe's death didn't make sense. The old man didn't pay for it, and the town moved on, as towns do. But I couldn't forget what we'd heard out there, in those woods. It was the kind of thing that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world. You realize that sometimes, no matter how much you try to make sense of it, some things are just too dark to understand. I still don't know exactly what happened that night, but I've gone over it in my head more times than I can count. It was supposed to be just another backwoods trip with my buddies. One of those last minute, we've got a few days off, let's hit the woods kind of things. We weren't new to camping, and we'd done a couple weekend trips before, mostly staying close to trailheads or established campgrounds. But this one was different. One of my friends had found this spot on a map, way up in the Adirondacks, completely off-grid. No trails, no shelters, no cell service. Just a long, rough dirt road to a remote lake with a small patch of flat ground on one end that looked good enough to set up a tent. He promised we could drive right up to it in the Jeep, unload our stuff, and have the whole area to ourselves. We left later than we should have. By the time we got into the woods, the sun had already set, and the last half hour was total blackness. The road in was worse than we thought. Nothing but washed-out ruts, roots, rocks, and narrow tree gaps. We crawled through in low gear most of the way. Our headlights kept catching glimpses of branches just inches from the windshield, and the GPS had long since stopped making any sense. We were only guessing at this point. We knew the lake had to be close because we could see it on the topo map earlier, but in the dark, everything looked the same. The worst part was when we reached what looked like the clearing and started backing into park. The ground sloped a little, and then suddenly the back tires lost traction. The Jeep slipped a few feet before we stopped it, just in time. We got out and realized we were less than 2 feet from the edge of the lake. Black, glass-still water right there behind the bumper. We hadn't seen it at all. That shook us more than any of us admitted at the time. We managed to set up camp with headlamps and flashlights. The fire was stubborn. It had rained a few days earlier, so everything was just damp enough to fight us, but eventually it caught. We threw on extra wood to get a good coal base going. Our tent was one of those big 4-man setups, plenty of room to lay out sleeping bags side by side. I remember thinking we'd have a great view of the lake in the morning. There were no sounds out there, not even bugs, just the wind in the trees and the occasional splash out on the lake. Fish maybe, or something else. I tried not to think about it too much. The darkness out there wasn't like what you get near towns or even most campgrounds. This was the kind of dark that feels heavy, like it's sitting on you. After getting everything arranged and the fire burning low, we all climbed into our sleeping bags. I wasn't tired, really, just wired from the drive and from being out there in the middle of nowhere. The silence didn't help. Every sound felt bigger, closer. I was trying to relax, listening to the last few pops from the fire when the drumming started. It wasn't loud at first, just a faint, rhythmic thumping. I thought it was something mechanical at first, but that made no sense. We were an hour from the last cell signal, and we hadn't passed a single cabin or road since we turned off the highway. But the sound was unmistakable, like someone beating on hollow logs or big plastic barrels. A steady pattern, not random, not nature. Came from out over the water, or at least that's how it sounded. It didn't echo the way it should have if it had been coming from the woods. It was just out there, floating across the lake. I didn't say anything. No one did. We just laid there, each of us definitely hearing it and probably hoping the others would pretend not to. There was a point where it got a little louder, more people joining in or the rhythm speeding up, like a small group of people drumming in unison. No voices, no talking, just the sound of the drums. Then slowly, over maybe 15 minutes, it faded away. Nothing replaced it, no splash, no boat motor, no wind. Just gone. Eventually I must have fallen asleep, though I don't remember when. I was in that half-dream state, where time doesn't make sense and every noise outside the tent becomes part of the dream. But then I woke up, instantly alert. It was like something had cracked or snapped just outside the tent, and it didn't belong in the dream world. It was real. A dry branch, definitely. I knew that sound. I've heard it enough while hiking, dry weight breaking a stick underfoot. My heart started pounding. It wasn't just the noise. It was how close it had been. Maybe 10 feet, maybe less. I turned my head slowly, trying not to make a sound in my sleeping bag. The others were all asleep. One of them, maybe Dave, had rolled onto his back and was snoring lightly, little grunting sounds every few seconds. He didn't have sleep apnea or anything, but it was loud enough that I remember thinking, Jesus Christ, shut up. I was closest to the edge of the tent, the side facing the lake. There was still a dull orange glow from the fire outside, enough to light up the side of the tent fabric. Just barely, but enough that I could see shadows. I turned onto my side, carefully, and looked at the wall of the tent. That's when I saw it. A shape moved between me and the fire. Just a flicker of motion at first, but solid enough that the light dimmed noticeably for a moment as it passed. It wasn't a person. I knew that immediately. It was too tall, too wide. It didn't move like a person. Whatever it was big. I froze completely. My first thought was bear, and it locked into my brain with that kind of deep animal panic. I stopped breathing for a second. Then I forced myself to breathe slowly through my nose, just shallow breaths, trying not to move. I couldn't see it anymore, but I could hear something. Slow crunching on the gravel and pine needles. Not running, not stomping, just deliberate weight shifting around. It moved toward the back of the tent, then paused. My mind was racing, playing out every possibility. Bear? Moose? Person? I hated that last one even more. A bear might walk through and move on. A person out there at 3:30 in the morning, in the middle of nowhere, without a flashlight or a vehicle. That scared me worse than anything. I don't know how long I laid there. Felt like forever. The snoring didn't stop, and I kept flinching every time it hit a particularly loud snort. I was half expecting whatever was out there to react, to move in closer, maybe swipe at the tent. Every single minute that passed felt like an hour. My muscles were stiff, my jaw was clenched, and I was sweating even though the night air was cold enough to fog up the tent's fabric where I breathed too close to it. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned carefully, using my elbows to crawl toward the center of the tent. I reached out and tapped my friend closest to me. He stirred a little, and I tapped again, more urgently. I whispered his name, trying not to be loud, just enough to get him to sit up. He looked confused, but I gestured with my hand to tell him something was outside. I could barely see him, just the shape of him silhouetted against the faint firelight coming through the mesh ceiling. I didn't hear anything leave. That's what bothered me. I hadn't heard the thing walk away. No snapping branches, no crunch of steps fading into the woods. Just silence. He unzipped the tent and crawled out before I could stop him. No flashlight, just stepped out barefoot into the dirt. I almost stayed in the tent, but I couldn't leave him out there alone. I grabbed the little headlamp from near my sleeping bag and followed. Outside, the fire had burned down to just a glowing pile of red and orange coals. The sky above was completely black. No moon, just a few faint stars visible through the canopy. My friend stood still, scanning the tree line. I clicked on my headlamp and swept it around. Nothing. We checked the immediate area around the tent, maybe 30 feet in every direction. No sign of anything. No fresh prints we could see in the loose gravel. Nothing disturbed. I expected to at least find paw prints or hear something moving off in the woods, but it was like the whole forest had stopped breathing. After a few minutes, we went back into the tent. My heart hadn't slowed down. I laid there the rest of the night, not sleeping, just listening. Every tiny sound made me jump. The wind picked up once or twice and a few pine cones fell, but there were no more footsteps, no more movement. By the time the first bit of light started filtering through the trees, I felt like I'd aged 5 years. The others woke up slowly, groaning and stretching and talking about breakfast. I didn't say much. Neither did the guy who'd gone out with me. We both just started packing things up without really talking about it. The idea of staying another night there felt like something we didn't need to discuss. We just weren't going to do it. Once we got the fire restarted and made some quick instant coffee, I walked the area again, just to be sure. I thought maybe I imagined it, that maybe the fear had made things up in my head. But then I found it. Near the edge of the lake, maybe 20 feet from where we'd set up the tent, there was a tree with a deep scratch down the trunk. It wasn't fresh, it had dried over, probably a few days old, but it was the kind of mark you don't get from deer or wind. It was wide and deep, maybe from claws. There were a few more like it on nearby trees, and one tree had part of the bark rubbed completely off, the pale wood underneath showing clearly. That's when I was sure. Something big had been there, maybe not that night, but recently. Bear, most likely. Black bear, maybe even a big one. No grizzly that far east, but still. Enough to be dangerous. We packed up and drove out mid-morning. It was 8 years ago, a crisp fall weekend that had always been our family's retreat. We'd done this every year, a group getaway for families from my husband's company. This time was special, though. Things were going well for the company, and we were flush with a bit of extra money. For the first time, we decided to skip the communal bunkhouses and rent a camper instead. It seemed like a good idea at the time. We'd get the full experience of the outdoors, but with the comfort of air conditioning and privacy. The RV rental company even had a deal for us. They said it would cost the same for 2 nights as it would for 3, so we decided to keep the camper until Monday, even though the retreat itself was ending on Sunday. The weekend itself went by without incident. We spent time hiking, joining in group activities, and socializing. It was unseasonably hot for October, but we were grateful for the AC inside the camper. The kids, 3 girls all under the age of 10, were happy. They'd run around with the other children at the retreat, play games, and generally wear themselves out. My husband and I got some quiet moments here and there to relax, even though there were constant comings and goings of people. Everything seemed fine, but by Sunday evening, things started to go wrong. Around 6 o'clock, we noticed a strange smell inside the camper. At first, it was faint, and I figured it was just some dust or something, but by the time the clock hit 8:30, it was unmistakable. The smell of sewage filled the air. My husband inspected the bathroom and realized the toilet was starting to back up. Not only that, but the whole camper smelled like something had been festering for a long time. It turned out the previous renters hadn't bothered to clear out the septic lines, and it was now our problem. My husband wasn't thrilled about it. We were already in a bit of a bind, not wanting to deal with the rental company accusing us of causing the problem, so he decided to drive to the nearby Walmart in the neighboring town. The drive was going to be long, over an hour round trip at least. He promised it wouldn't take long, just a quick run for some drain cleaner, and I'd be fine handling things with the kids for the time being. I wasn't thrilled about him leaving, but what else could we do? It was about 8:30 when he left, and I immediately started packing up our things. The kids were already getting antsy, asking questions about what we were doing, and I tried to distract them with simple tasks. I figured we had time to clean up before the long drive home the next day. The RV was small, and with all the kids running in and out, I could feel the tension in the air. It was one of those moments where you realize you've become hyper-aware of everything going on around you, even though it should have just been a normal evening. By 9:15, I was starting to feel uneasy. The girls were all tucked into bed, but I couldn't shake the weird feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the smell or the fact that we were so isolated in this large campground with hardly anyone else around. I tried to push the thoughts away. The place was practically empty, and I had heard that it wasn't unusual for there to be long stretches of time where you didn't see many people. The retreat space was mostly used by the church, and except for a few events during the year, the place was often quiet. I tried to settle down. I climbed into the loft bed above the truck can and grabbed a book, hoping it would distract me. The soft hum of the AC in the background was calming, and I figured that once the kids were asleep and my husband returned, I could finally relax. But as the minutes ticked on, I noticed something. There was a faint clicking sound coming from the window behind me. At first, I thought it was just the wind or trees brushing against the glass, a normal outdoor sound. But then it happened again, click, click, click. My heart rate picked up slightly, and I tensed. It wasn't like the usual sounds of nature, the breeze rustling the leaves or the occasional animal. This was different. I lay still in the bed, trying to listen more closely, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But then I heard the scraping, a faint scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across glass. It wasn't wind or nature. It was deliberate. I felt a cold rush of panic hit my chest. My mind raced through every possible explanation, but nothing made sense. I tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it away. Maybe an animal was just climbing along the side of the camper, or maybe it was the wind. But my gut told me it was something else. Something was wrong. The scraping continued. I pushed myself up from the bed, careful not to make any noise. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I carefully made my way down the ladder to the kitchen. The noise didn't stop. It followed me, growing more distinct with every step. My hand shook as I grabbed the knife from the kitchen drawer, just in case. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but something about the sound made me feel like I had to be prepared. As I moved into the loft, I kept my eyes trained on the windows, the door. Everything had to be locked. My mind was racing, thinking through the possible escape routes if something went wrong. I tried to get a signal on my phone, but there was no service. Nothing. The security at the campground was a joke, and I was completely alone. The kids were asleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was out there knew I was here. It felt too intentional, too calculated. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for the sound to stop, waiting for something, anything, to give me an answer. I glanced out the window and saw nothing, just the dim moonlight and shadows. No one was walking around, no sign of movement except the trees. But then, just as I thought I was losing my mind, I heard it again. The handle on the door rattled. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Someone was outside trying to get in. I pressed myself back into the corner of the loft, clutching the knife. Couldn't believe it. I thought of the kids, all tucked in and oblivious. I thought of my husband, who was hours away from being home. What if I couldn't protect them? My thoughts spiraled as I huddled there, listening, praying for the noise to stop. I couldn't see anything. The door handle rattled again, louder this time, followed by more scraping on the window. Whoever was out there was trying to get in. The minutes stretched on. I could feel my heart racing, each thump in my chest loud and unsettling. I glanced down at my phone, still no signal. The fear of being isolated hit me full force. I had no way to reach anyone for help. There was nothing I could do except wait for my husband to return. It felt like hours had passed before I saw the headlights in the distance, winding their way down the dark, narrow road toward the campground. When my husband finally walked in, he looked at me like I had lost my mind. He scoffed at me, rolling his eyes, dismissing my fears. "What? You think someone's going to break out of prison and attack us out here in the middle of nowhere?" He laughed. I tried to explain what had happened, the rattling door, the scraping noises, but he wasn't having it. He told me it was just the wind or some animals. He was annoyed that I had worked myself up over nothing. That night, I hardly slept, tossing and turning, my mind running through the possibilities. What if someone really had been out there? What if they had been trying to get in? But everything seemed fine the next morning. My husband and I packed up the camper and drove into the town to return it. It wasn't until the rental manager came around to inspect the RV that we learned just how close we had come to a much worse situation. The manager, a thin, stern man, walked up to my husband and started pointing out the damage. "Do you know what happened to the rear window?" he asked. My husband looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Apparently, someone had used a knife or some other sharp object to slice through the window gasket, where I had been sitting just the night before. There were clear gashes in the paint, consistent with knife marks. The window lock was damaged as well. The manager said it looked like someone had also tried to pry open the door, using the same knife to jam it into the lock. They hadn't gotten in, but it was clear someone had been trying. I felt my stomach drop. I had been right. Someone had been out there trying to break in. My husband and I exchanged a look, both of us shaken by what we had discovered. But the manager assured us that we wouldn't be charged for the damage, as it was obvious it hadn't been our fault. But the feeling of relief didn't come. It was replaced by a deep sense of unease that never quite went away. We left the campground that day, and we haven't been back since. I haven't gone on a solo camping trip since then either. Safety in numbers, as they say. The whole experience left me shaken, knowing that we had been so close to something much worse. I can still feel the cold weight of that fear, the uncertainty that came with not knowing who was out there. And even though I didn't see the face of whoever was trying to break in, I still wonder if they were watching us the whole time, waiting for the right moment. It's a fear that stays with me, a reminder of how fragile our safety can be in situations we think are harmless. And I still can't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I worked at a sleepaway summer camp several years ago. It was deep in the woods, tucked away in a place where the nearest town was an hour's drive. And even then, it was small enough to be easy to miss. There were about 30 of us on staff that summer, mostly young adults just trying to enjoy the outdoors while also keeping an eye on a bunch of energetic kids. The camp was designed for kids who wanted to experience nature. Hiking, canoeing, campfires, all of it. But sometimes, things in the woods can be a little more than you expect. It was a late-night staff meeting. I can still remember the warmth of the room, the smell of coffee that had been brewed too late in the day, and the tired faces of the counselors around the table. We were winding down after a long day. The kids were in their cabins, asleep for the night. The only thing that kept us awake was the long list of tasks we had to get through before we could finally crawl into bed ourselves. But then, from outside, we heard something. First, it was soft, a distant noise barely there. It wasn't clear at first what it was, just a weird, unsettling sound, like something trying to scream but not quite getting it right. A sort of high-pitched cry, almost like the whimper of a baby. It was faint but distinct, cutting through the quiet night air. Everyone froze. We all turned toward the door like a collective instinct. The sound came again, louder this time, and there was no mistaking it. It was the cry of a baby, but wrong. Something about it felt off, like it didn't belong in the woods. It didn't make any sense. There were no houses nearby, no families camping out here. The only people at the camp were the staff and the kids, of course. The closest town, as I said, was an hour away. A baby? This deep in the woods? For a few seconds, no one spoke. I think we were all just trying to make sense of it in our heads. Then, one of the other counselors, Jack, stood up, his face set with determination. "I'll go check it out," he said, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. His tone was practical, like it was just another night in the woods, but I could see the unease on his face. He turned to the rest of us. "Who's with me?" I didn't want to go. Honestly, I didn't. Something about that cry, that pitiful wail, didn't sit right with me. But I couldn't back down. Everyone else in the room was looking at Jack, and somehow I felt like if I didn't join him, I'd never be able to explain myself later. So I stood up. Then Sarah, another counselor, volunteered. The three of us headed out into the woods, armed with nothing but flashlights and the determination to figure out what the hell was going on. The night was cold, colder than it should have been for a summer night. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, leaves, and pine. The woods were quiet aside from the strange cries echoing through the trees. We kept walking, our boots crunching on the fallen leaves, the light from our flashlights flickering in the distance. The sound seemed to come from further in, just beyond the tree line. As we moved deeper into the woods, the air got heavier. The sound of the cry faded in and out, almost like it was circling us. It was unnerving. Every step felt like we were getting closer to something we shouldn't be. My heart was thudding in my chest, but I told myself to keep going. After all, it was just a baby, right? Maybe some lost camper? Or some animal making a noise that sounded like a baby. It had to be that, I reasoned. Then we saw it. It wasn't a baby at all. We reached the edge of a small, slow-moving stream that cut through the woods, its dark water reflecting the moonlight. And there, lying on the bank, was a rabbit. It was barely moving, blood slowly flowing from its body into the stream. I felt my stomach lurch at the sight of it. Its fur was matted with dirt and blood, its body twisted in a way that made it clear it had been through something horrible. It wasn't just injured, it was dying. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stood there, staring at the poor thing. The rabbit's breathing was shallow, its eyes half closed, and the blood flowed down into the stream, turning the water a dull red. It was a pitiful sight, one that made my skin crawl. It was clear that something had ripped this animal apart. The sight was enough to make me feel sick to my stomach. Jack was the first to speak, his voice low and shaky. "A fox probably did this," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "I'll put it out of its misery." Sarah and I exchanged a look. We both knew something wasn't right, but neither of us said anything. We were all too rattled by the sight of the rabbit, too distracted by the gruesome image to think straight. Jack knelt down by the animal, his hands shaking as he prepared to end its suffering. But just as he moved to touch the rabbit, a noise broke the silence. The sound of something moving in the woods. It was a heavy, deliberate sound. Not the rustling of a smaller animal, but something much larger. Something that didn't belong in a place like this. We all froze. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was no mistaking it. Whatever it was moving towards us. The air around us seemed to grow even colder. We turned, our flashlights dancing nervously across the dark forest. For a moment, there was nothing. Then we heard it again, this time much closer. A deep growl, followed by the distinct snap of a branch under heavy paws. Then we saw it, the shadow of something large, lurking just beyond the reach of our flashlights. It was too big to be a fox, a large shape creeping just at the edge of the trees. Jack's face turned white. He stood up quickly, backing away from the stream. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice hoarse. I didn't need any more convincing. Sarah and I turned and started running. Jack followed close behind us. We didn't dare look back, not even for a second. We just kept running, the sound of our pounding feet filling the night air. We didn't stop until we were back within sight of the staff house, where the warm light from the windows seemed like the only safe place left in the world. But then something happened that I'll never forget. As we reached the edge of the clearing, Jack came running past us. His clothes were drenched in blood, bright red, soaked into his shirt and pants. His eyes were wide, and his breath came in short, panicked gasps. "What happened?" I managed to ask, though the question barely made sense in my own head. My heart was still racing. Jack didn't answer immediately. He just kept running, his footsteps loud and frantic, until we reached the staff house. We burst through the door, and the meeting inside went silent. We were all breathing heavily, still in shock from what we'd just seen. Jack staggered to the center of the room, covered in blood, and collapsed onto one of the chairs. That's when he told us what had happened. That growl we'd heard? It wasn't just any animal. It was a cougar, a big one, and it had been after the rabbit. The reason Jack had come back covered in blood was that, in a last-ditch effort to escape, he had thrown the now-dead rabbit at the cougar, hoping to distract it long enough to get away. The cougar had lunged at the rabbit, but Jack had managed to slip past it, running back to us. We all stood there, stunned, processing what he was saying. A cougar? That was the thing that had been stalking us in the woods? The very same one that had been crying like a baby to lure us in? The camp director immediately went into emergency mode. Within minutes, the camp was under wildlife lockdown. The entire staff was on alert, and rangers were called in to help track and trap the cougar. The next few hours felt surreal as we all sat in the staff house, too shaken to sleep, waiting for updates. Eventually, the rangers found tracks and evidence that confirmed our worst fears. The cougar had been in the area for a while, hunting and stalking the woods near the camp. They set up traps and used calls to try to lure it out, but thankfully, by morning, the animal had been caught. It was a massive cougar, probably the biggest anyone had seen in years. That night, we all learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes, the sounds of the wild can deceive you. The cry of a baby wasn't a baby at all. It was the sound of a dying rabbit, being hunted by something far more dangerous than we ever could have imagined. We never went back into the woods that night. We stayed inside, glued to the windows, waiting for the rangers to finish their work. And that was the end of it. The cougar was taken away, and the camp eventually resumed normal operations. But that night, it was something I'll never forget. The lesson was clear. If you ever hear a cry in the woods, something that sounds like a baby, don't go after it. The woods don't care about you. You're not supposed to be there. I've always loved camping, ever since I was a kid. Growing up in the mountains, it was just a part of life. My family spent most weekends in the woods, whether it was hiking, fishing, or just setting up camp under the stars. But somewhere along the way, life took me away from those mountains. Work, relationships, city life, it all got in the way. It had been more than 10 years since I'd last spent a night in the wilderness, and I'd been craving it. So, when I finally got the chance to take a solo trip back to the mountains, I didn't hesitate. The drive was long, too long, honestly. I didn't leave until late afternoon, and by the time I reached the area I wanted to camp, twilight was already beginning to settle in. I had planned to find a spot and set up camp by nightfall, but that didn't happen. The sun dipped behind the ridges, and the trees were already starting to cast long shadows when I pulled off the main road onto a narrow, winding back road in the national forest. I had planned to camp somewhere more established, but I figured I'd just find a quiet spot off the beaten path for the night. I found a place near a small creek. It seemed perfect, quiet, tucked away, and far from any roads. I figured it'd be a good spot to sleep in the truck. I wasn't ready to set up a tent, not with the light fading fast. So, I stuffed my sleeping bag and air mattress into the back of the truck's cab, made sure everything was secure, and settled in for the night. But then, something felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first. The woods were dead quiet. Not a single bird call, not a rustle of leaves from a squirrel or a rabbit. Just silence. The kind of silence that presses in on you, makes you feel like something is wrong. I've camped enough to know that the woods don't get that quiet unless something's up. Even at night, you usually hear something, a night owl, a breeze, something. But here, nothing. First, I brushed it off. Could have just been the time of day. The light fading, animals starting to settle down. I kept working, pulling out the last of my gear. That's when I heard it. A loud, shrill alarm call from a Steller's jay. The bird was clearly agitated. It was a warning, but for what? Corvids like jays, crows, and ravens are known for their ability to sense danger. They'll alert the other animals when they spot something threatening. I stood still, listening, trying to figure out what had spooked the bird. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a blur, too fast to make out clearly. But I saw enough to know it wasn't a deer or any of the usual forest animals I'd expect to see. There, between two trees on the far side of the creek, I saw a shape moving. It was tawny, blending into the shadows of the forest. I didn't see the head or the tail, just the top of its hindquarters as it passed behind some brush. For a second, I thought maybe it was a deer. That's what my brain wanted to believe. But the more I thought about it, the more something didn't sit right. Deer make noise when they move, especially in the forest with all the leaves and pine needles on the ground. They step on things, they break branches, they make the woods sound alive. This thing made no sound. Nothing. It was as quiet as a shadow. A sinking feeling hit my stomach. It was a predator. It had to be. I knew the signs, even if I didn't want to admit it. The way it moved, the silence, the fact that it was large and tawny. It had to be a mountain lion. The thought hit me like a punch in the chest. I'd heard stories of mountain lions in the area, but I'd never thought I'd come face to face with one. My eyes scanned the woods. The way the animal had been moving, it seemed like it was headed in my direction. And I was near a creek. If it was going to cross, I'd see it. I hurried to finish setting up the back of the truck, my mind racing. I needed to get inside the cab where I'd be safe. But the feeling of being watched, being hunted, was growing stronger by the second. It wasn't just the quiet or the bird's warning call anymore. It was the oppressive sense that something was out there, waiting, observing. I pulled the last of my gear into the truck and slammed the tailgate shut. The sound echoed in the otherwise still air, sharp and loud. And then, almost immediately, I heard it. 3 deep, powerful bounds. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't running away, but it was moving fast, away from the truck, heading toward the creek. But then it stopped. I couldn't hear it anymore. The silence was even thicker now. My heart was pounding in my chest. It was like the forest itself had held its breath. I didn't wait. I jumped into the truck, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I could feel my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I stared out the windshield into the darkness. The headlights cut a narrow path of light, but the woods beyond were just black shadows. I tried to calm myself, tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, but deep down I knew there was something out there. I didn't sleep that night. Every small sound, every rustle of branches or shift of leaves made me jump. My eyes stayed wide open, scanning the trees, the dark corners of the clearing, expecting to see that tawny shape again. But it never appeared. I kept the lights on for most of the night, hoping it would help keep whatever was out there away. But I knew it was just a comfort, not a real defense. A mountain lion doesn't care about headlights. It's not going to be scared off by the sound of a car. If anything, it might just be more curious. Time passed slowly, the minutes stretching out like hours. Every now and then, I would hear a distant crack of a branch, but nothing close enough to make me think it was the cat. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. Maybe it was just the adrenaline, or maybe it was something primal, an instinct that told me to stay alert. By the time morning light started to filter through the trees, I was exhausted but still on edge. I hadn't heard anything in the last few hours, and that was a little comforting. I had been convinced that the cat would return in the dark, but as the sun began to rise, the woods slowly came back to life. Birds started to call again. The soft murmur of the creek resumed its gentle flow, and the world felt normal again. I wasn't about to stick around to see if the mountain lion came back, though. I'd had enough for one night. I started the truck and slowly backed it out of the clearing, my eyes scanning the trees, half expecting the cat to emerge from the shadows. But there was nothing. I drove out of there without looking back. As I headed down the road, I couldn't help but feel a rush of mixed emotions. I was shaken, yes, but there was also a part of me that was exhilarated. I just had a real encounter with one of the wildest predators in North America, and I'd made it through the night, which meant something, even if I hadn't exactly been brave about it. For the rest of my trip, I camped in more populated areas, where the chances of seeing anything like that again were slim. But that one night, when the woods went silent and I realized I wasn't alone, stayed with me. It was terrifying, but it was also a reminder of why I love the wilderness. There's something raw and powerful about it, something that makes you feel alive. Even if that life is a little too close to the edge. I still camp alone most of the time. And while I'm more cautious now, I can't say I'm afraid. The wilderness is unpredictable, and danger is always lurking. But that's part of the thrill. It's why I keep coming back. There's nothing quite like the feeling of being in the woods, where you're truly on your own, but at the same time, connected to something bigger. Even if, sometimes, that something is a mountain lion watching you from the trees. The night we arrived at the campsite, it was already past midnight. We had been driving for hours, the road twisting and turning as we made our way into the wilderness. Our group of 4 friends had been planning this camping trip for weeks, looking forward to the weekend of hiking, fishing, and just getting away from everything. But we didn't arrive on time to do much else other than set up our tents and huddle around the fire for a short while before crashing. The campsite was just outside of a small town that was famous for its day-long rafting trips on a river that ran through the area. We didn't have much time to explore it, though, as the sun had already dipped behind the mountains, leaving the forest in near total darkness. I remember stumbling through the woods with my friends, trying to set up our tent, our flashlights flickering and casting weak beams through the trees. The sound that night was odd, something I couldn't place. It wasn't quite the rustling of a typical breeze, but more like something larger moving through the forest. The leaves shifted violently as if something unseen was pushing through them. At first, I thought it was just the wind, nothing unusual. But it didn't stop. The rustling grew louder, and I remember feeling a bit unsettled, as if whatever was causing the sound was all around us, too close for comfort. But we were kids, and our excitement overpowered any uneasy feelings we might have had. We pushed it aside and focused on setting up camp. The other guys didn't seem too concerned about the noise, so I shrugged it off too. We set up our tent and then gathered around the fire. The only light we had was from our lantern and the faint glow of our flashlights. As we sat there, talking about nothing and everything at once, I kept hearing that rustling sound, still more intense than the usual nighttime breeze. It was like something brushing against the trees, constantly moving. Eventually, we went to sleep, or at least I tried to. The noise outside continued, but it was almost like a background hum now, something I didn't want to acknowledge because if I thought about it too much, I knew I'd end up too freaked out to sleep. So I just shut my eyes and focused on the feeling of the air around me, the sounds of the forest lulling me into a false sense of security. The rustling kept going, though, like it was waiting for something or someone. Around 3 or 4 in the morning, I woke up, needing to pee. I looked around the tent, noticing that the other guys were still asleep, their bodies sprawled across the floor. I didn't want to wake them, so I decided to venture out by myself. We had a pretty secluded spot, and I didn't think it would be that far to walk to find a place to relieve myself. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, squinting in the dark as my eyes adjusted to the dim moonlight. I had my flashlight with me, but I decided not to turn it on. I didn't want to disturb anyone else. I stepped lightly on the forest floor, trying to be as quiet as possible. I wandered away from the tent, further than I had originally intended, but I figured I was just a bit too lazy to turn back yet. There was still that rustling sound in the trees, but I had grown used to it. It was only when I took a few steps further away from the camp that I realized just how thick the forest was around me. The trees felt taller and darker, the shadows deeper. I kept walking. After a minute, I finally found a small clearing and squatted down, taking a moment to appreciate the stillness. The rustling sound, which had been constant, seemed to have faded into the background. All I could hear was the faint chirping of crickets and the sound of my breathing, shallow in the cool night air. As I finished, I stood up and turned to head back to the tent. It was then that I realized how far I had actually wandered. I wasn't sure where exactly I had gone, but I had stepped far enough away from the camp that I couldn't see any of the familiar trees or the tent's outline. The forest was thick with underbrush, and I couldn't make out anything around me. The moonlight barely filtered through the trees. I should have brought my flashlight, I realized then, and cursed myself for not doing so. I felt uneasy, and suddenly, that rustling sound, which I had dismissed earlier, felt more menacing. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just the wind. But the wind didn't rustle leaves like that. It was too deliberate, too continuous. It didn't feel like nature anymore. I started walking back towards the camp, trying to retrace my steps, but everything around me looked the same. The trees were thick, the shadows deep. The forest had swallowed me up more than I realized, and now I was lost in it. I thought I saw a shape in the distance, and my heart skipped. It was just the shadows playing tricks on me, I told myself, but the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. I pushed on, trying to stay calm, and after a minute, I thought I saw the faint outline of our tent in the distance. I started walking faster, hoping to make my way back. That's when I finally understood what had been causing the rustling. It wasn't just a random breeze, no, the sound was the river. The river that ran nearby, down in a gorge I hadn't even realized was so close. The sound of the water flowing over rocks, mixed with the wind, made it seem like the trees themselves were alive, moving in unnatural ways. I had wandered so close to the river's edge that I could feel the cold moisture in the air. The water roared in the distance, a sound I hadn't recognized in the dark. I wasn't just a few feet from the riverbank. I had nearly stumbled right into it. The ground near the edge was steep and treacherous, and if I had taken one more wrong step, I could have been pulled into the water without anyone even realizing I was gone. I don't think I've ever been so scared in my life. My heart was pounding in my chest as I quickly turned and found my way back to the tent, my feet nearly slipping in the wet, mossy ground. I finally made it back, heart still racing. I crawled into the tent and lay there, staring up at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something much worse than a bad fall or a cold swim. The next morning, I learned just how close I had come to disaster. I had been so close to the river that I could have fallen in without anyone knowing. The water was fast-moving and dangerous, especially after dark when it was harder to see. The rustling sound that had freaked me out wasn't the wind, after all. It was the river, roaring louder than I could have ever imagined in the dead of night. I never went back outside without my flashlight after that, and I've never been that careless since. The memory of the water, so close, still makes me uneasy when I think back on that trip. I had been so sure of myself, convinced that I knew the woods and the night, but in the end, I learned just how easily nature could take me by surprise. I think about that night often, especially when I'm out camping. It serves as a reminder. Always respect the wilderness, and never forget the little things, like bringing a flashlight, because it only takes one small mistake to change everything. It was the middle of October, that weird time in the desert when it could be freezing in the morning but hot by noon. My uncle has always been into dirt biking, and every few weeks, he and a group of his friends would haul out their trailers, bikes, coolers, and gear to some far-off patch of BLM land in the desert. No service, no bathrooms, no shade, just open scrubland and endless space. They liked it that way. No rules, no crowds, just the dirt and the bikes. I wasn't with them on this trip, but I remember the story clear as day because of how weird it was. My uncle told me when he got back, and the way he told it, calm, no drama, no big expressions, made it stick even more. You could tell it rattled him a little, though he wouldn't admit it. They'd arrived the day before, just before sundown, pulling their trailers in a rough circle. My uncle had one of those toy haulers that lets down into a ramp for the bikes, and his friend Mike had a small pull-behind camper. They always brought folding chairs, coolers, portable grills, firewood, and sometimes even a cornhole set. That night had been like most of their trips. They grilled sausages, had a small fire, drank beers, and talked trash until late. Then they put the fire out with sand and went to bed. At some point in the early morning, just as the sky was starting to change from black to that dull bluish gray, my uncle woke up. He was always the first one up. Habit from years of being on job sites early, I guess. He stepped out of the trailer, wrapped in a hoodie, and went over to the generator to get it running before everyone else stirred. That's when he saw the guy. The chairs they'd circled around the fire pit were still there, and in one of them, sitting completely still, was a man. He wasn't one of my uncle's friends. He was just sitting there, elbows on knees, looking into the faint orange smolder of the fire pit like he'd been doing it for hours. At first, my uncle thought maybe one of the guys had invited someone else, or maybe it was Mike's cousin or something. But after a few seconds, it hit him that he didn't recognize the guy at all. He looked around, scanning the scrub brush and low hills that stretched in every direction. There was no car, no truck, no ATV, no dirt bike. Nothing. No headlights, no tracks in the sand that looked fresh, no boot prints even. They were at least a mile from the next known campsite. Probably more. That's how they liked it. They picked remote spots, always far from the usual crowds. Still, the guy didn't move or say anything. My uncle didn't know what to make of it, but he wasn't the type to panic. He walked back inside, closed the trailer door, and woke up two of the other guys. They all came outside together and walked over to the man. When they got closer, they could smell alcohol coming off him. Not the sharp, fresh kind either. More like the sour, stale stench of someone who'd been drinking for a long time. He was asleep. Somehow, he'd sat down in the chair and passed out upright. The guy looked rough. Dirty jeans, a sweatshirt that had seen better days, sunburn peeling on his nose and cheeks, and caked dust around his shoes like he'd been walking a while. When they woke him up, he didn't freak out or try to run or act weird. He just blinked a bunch and looked around like he was trying to figure out where he was. Once he was fully awake, they started trying to figure out where he came from. My uncle said the guy looked dazed, dehydrated, hungover. It took a few minutes before he seemed to get his bearings. Then he asked if they could give him a ride back to where his camp was. Said he'd gotten turned around or something. One of the guys agreed to take him, so my uncle climbed in the front seat of the truck with him while the guy rode in the back. They figured if he was in trouble or something, it was better to help him out before the heat of the day hit. In the desert, that kind of morning chill fades fast, and by 10 it can feel like a blow dryer on your face. They drove in the direction the guy pointed. At first, they thought he was confused. There was nothing out there for miles. But after a little over 3 miles, they saw a small group of RVs parked near the edge of a dry wash. A few people were milling around, and when my uncle pulled up, he noticed there were state troopers there too. 2 patrol SUVs with lights but no sirens. As soon as they pulled up, one of the troopers walked over. My uncle stayed quiet while the other guy got out and started talking to the officer. The trooper listened, nodded, then motioned to another officer, and they brought the guy over to talk more. Nobody seemed freaked out. More like they were just checking boxes, making sure nothing got missed. One of the people at the camp, a woman in her 30s, came over and started thanking my uncle and his buddy for bringing the guy back. Turns out he'd been drinking like crazy the night before and, for some reason, took one of the camp's golf carts and just drove off into the night. No one noticed right away, but when they realized he was gone and the golf cart was missing, they panicked and called it in. They searched around their camp, sent a few guys out in trucks to scout the area, but no one found anything. Eventually, the golf cart was located off a rough trail about 1.5 miles out of camp. It had run out of gas. The guy must have just ditched it and started walking in a random direction. From there, he must have just wandered the desert on foot, probably still drunk or at least totally out of it, until he stumbled on my uncle's trailer in the dark. Somehow, he avoided cactus patches, didn't fall into a wash, didn't get bit by anything. He just walked, maybe for hours in the pitch black, and then sat down in one of the folding chairs and passed out. The troopers said they were just glad he hadn't gotten hurt. The woman who thanked my uncle said this wasn't the first time the guy had done something dumb while drinking, but it was the first time he disappeared into the desert. My uncle and his friend didn't stick around. They got in the truck and drove back to their own site. By then, the sun was up and the chill was gone. It was shaping up to be another dry, hot day. Back at their camp, they fired up the generator, made some coffee, and tried to go about their usual day. But the vibe had shifted a bit. Everyone was quieter than usual. It wasn't fear, really, more like unease. The idea that someone could just wander into their camp in the middle of the night, without them hearing a thing, and sit down in the middle of their stuff, it unsettled them. They didn't pack up or cut the trip short, but they were more careful after that. They checked their surroundings more often, kept their lights on a little longer at night, and made sure the fire was completely out before going to bed. My uncle never said it out loud, but I think it stuck with him how easy it was for someone to get that far out into the desert without help, and how close that could come to ending badly. He told me the story a week later when I was helping him load gear back into his garage. He didn't make it spooky or dramatic, just laid it out the way it happened, and I believed every word of it. There was no ghost, no hallucination, no horror movie twist. Just a guy, drunk and dumb, who wandered into the wrong camp in the middle of nowhere. But somehow that made it even creepier, because it actually happened. And out there, in that open desert with no fences, no streetlights, and no neighbors for miles, it makes you realize how easy it is for someone or something to show up out of nowhere and be sitting right next to you without you ever hearing a sound. That was enough to give me the chills. It was a cold night in the countryside, the kind of chill that settled in your bones and made the quiet of the world feel a little too heavy. We lived on a farm just outside of a small village, and the woods started about 15 meters from our front door. Our house was isolated enough that you could stand on the porch and hear nothing but the wind in the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful for the most part, but sometimes at night, that quiet had a way of making you feel like you were being watched, like something out there was just waiting for you to slip up. My brother, Jamie, was a creature of the night. He'd often take our dog, Chester, for walks in the woods after dark. Chester was a big, friendly lab, and he had a nose for adventure. He'd roam the fields and woods like it was his second home, always coming back for his dinner without a fuss. It didn't matter if it was 10 p.m. or later. The woods were his territory, and he loved being out there. It was around 10 p.m. one evening when Jamie came back looking shaken, his face pale, his eyes wide. I was sitting in the kitchen, messing around with my phone when I heard the door creak open. I thought Jamie would just be laughing about something silly that had happened out there, like he usually did. But this time, he just stood there in the doorway, looking like he'd seen a ghost. "What's up?" I asked, setting my phone down, sensing the change in his demeanor. He didn't answer right away. He looked over his shoulder at the woods, like he was making sure nothing was out there, and then finally spoke, his voice low and a bit shaky. "I lost Chester," he said. My heart sank. Chester? Lost? That was impossible. The dog had been in and out of those woods more times than I could count. He knew every tree, every path. He had never gotten lost before, not once. "What do you mean, you lost him?" I asked, trying to make sense of it. Jamie took a deep breath and started explaining. He said that he had taken Chester out for one of their usual walks. It was a clear night, with a full moon, and the woods had felt peaceful. But as they were walking deeper into the trees, Jamie's phone, which he used to navigate sometimes, had died. He wasn't too worried about it, though. He knew the woods well enough to get by without a phone. But then, something strange happened. Jamie told me that, as they were walking, right before he lost sight of the house, a beam of light had appeared, circling his feet. It wasn't like a flashlight or anything. It was a circular beam, almost like a spotlight, but brighter. It didn't last long, just a second or two, and then, before he could react, the light shot off into the woods in one direction, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. That's when Chester had disappeared. 1 minute he was there, walking calmly beside Jamie, and the next the dog was gone. It was like he had vanished into thin air. Jamie said he called out for him, but there was no response. He looked around, but the woods were quiet, unnaturally quiet, like everything had gone still. He'd retraced his steps, but Chester wasn't anywhere to be found. Panicked, Jamie had rushed back home. He didn't know what else to do. That's when he came to get me. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my flashlight, slipped on my boots, and we both headed back out into the woods. The night was cold and still, the kind of night where even the usual sounds of rustling leaves and distant animals were absent. The woods seemed unnervingly silent. I felt a tightness in my chest as I walked, a knot of anxiety that I couldn't shake off. There was something wrong about the way Jamie had looked when he came back. The way he described the light, the way Chester had just disappeared, it didn't sit right with me. We walked for what felt like an eternity, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness, casting long shadows on the trees. My mind raced, trying to think of anything that could explain what had happened. But nothing made sense. It was as if the woods themselves had swallowed up the dog, and whatever had caused that strange light was still lurking somewhere, unseen. I was about 20 seconds into the woods when I saw something in the distance, just a flicker of movement behind a large oak tree. My heart skipped a beat. I could feel a surge of relief mixed with confusion. There, just behind the tree, was Chester. He was standing still, his head low, his body tense. But there was something off about him. Chester wasn't acting like himself. He wasn't running around or wagging his tail like usual. Instead, he was moving slowly, as if each step was a struggle. His tail was tucked between his legs, and he was trembling. The way he looked at me was unsettling, like he didn't recognize me, or maybe like he was scared of me. "Chester," I called softly, stepping closer. He didn't respond the way he normally would, with his usual excited bark or wagging tail. He just kept walking slowly, almost dragging his feet, his eyes darting nervously around as if something was watching us. I called his name again, but he didn't stop. He just turned and began walking back toward the house. I followed him, my flashlight shaking in my hand, the beam flickering nervously. Chester didn't seem to care that I was behind him. He just walked with that same slow, fearful pace, his head low and his body tense. It was like he was in a daze, and I couldn't figure out why. What had happened out here? What had he seen or heard that made him act like this? By the time we got back to the house, Chester had stopped at the door and just sat down, looking up at me with those sad, fearful eyes. He didn't want to come inside, but he didn't move either. It was as if he was waiting for something, or maybe he was just too exhausted to move any further. I opened the door and stepped inside, letting Chester follow me in. He walked straight to his bed and lay down without a sound. He didn't even look at me. His breathing was shallow, his eyes wide and unfocused. It was like he had been through something that I couldn't even begin to understand. I sat down beside him, running my hand gently over his fur. He didn't react. He just lay there, still and quiet. I stayed with him for a while, not knowing what else to do, not knowing what had happened in those woods, or what had caused him to act this way. But one thing was clear. Something had scared him. Something out there in the woods that night had shaken him to his core. Over the next few days, Chester slowly returned to his usual self, but there was something different about him. He was more cautious, more alert. He didn't go near the woods anymore, even though they had always been his favorite place. Whenever we went outside, he would give the woods a wide berth, like he could feel something lurking just beyond the trees. Jamie and I talked about it a few times, trying to piece together what had happened. We both agreed that whatever it wasn't something normal. It wasn't just a wild animal or some weird natural occurrence. There was something else out there, something that made Chester act the way he did. We never went back into those woods the same way again. The strange light, Chester's fear, the silence that had swallowed the night. None of it made sense. But one thing I knew for sure. Something in those woods had changed, and we weren't going to be the same either. The woods had always been a place of comfort, but now, they were something else entirely. Chester never ventured near the woods again, and neither did I. And from that night on, the quiet that had once been soothing now felt suffocating. Every time the wind rustled through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting, just out of sight. And I knew, deep down, that the woods held secrets we were never meant to uncover. A few years ago, I went camping with a large group of friends. There were probably about 45 of us, a mix of old friends and a few new faces, all scattered across various campsites. We were excited for the weekend, everyone in good spirits, ready for the outdoors and the bonding time ahead. The main campground was full when my two friends and I arrived. No big deal, though. There were plenty of spots across the road near the river. It was quieter, a little more secluded, and we figured we'd have a better experience without all the noise from the larger group. We pulled up and set up our tent next to a dense patch of trees. The river was nearby, the sound of water rushing over rocks filling the air as we unloaded our gear. The sun was beginning to set, and the cool evening air felt nice against my skin. We hadn't even started the campfire yet when we realized the campground across the road had filled up more than we expected. We could hear the laughter and chatter of the larger group, so we were thankful for the peacefulness of our spot. The first night was great. We had a fire, roasted marshmallows, and caught up with one another. The night passed without incident, the sounds of crickets and the river lulling us into a calm sleep. I crawled into my sleeping bag, exhausted, and drifted off without a care in the world. I was in the middle of a dream when I woke up. It was the second night. The fire had burned down to embers, and the last remnants of warmth were dissipating from the air. I had no idea what time it was, but the darkness felt deep and still, almost too still. The kind of stillness that makes you uneasy when you're in the woods, surrounded by nature. The first thing that clued me in was the sound. Something was moving around outside our tent. I thought it was probably a deer or some other small animal. It was common for animals to wander through the area, especially at night. But then I heard a growl. It was low, deep, and chilling, the kind of sound that you feel in your chest. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote. It wasn't any animal I'd ever heard before. It sounded too deep, too guttural. I froze, lying in my sleeping bag, straining my ears to listen more closely. The growl came again, louder this time. There was no mistaking it. It was a cougar. The sound was unmistakable. I had heard about mountain lions being in the area, but I never really thought it would happen to us. I was instantly awake, heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the tension in the air, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear the animal moving around, pacing just outside our tent. The soft crunch of leaves underfoot, the movement of brush being disturbed. It was all too real. I could almost imagine the predator just outside, its eyes watching us, waiting. I glanced at my two friends, who were both still sleeping, unaware of the danger outside. One of them was closer to me, so I nudged her awake. I didn't want to wake the other friend, thinking she might panic and make things worse. My friend stirred, groggily opening her eyes. "What's going on?" she whispered, barely audible. "There's something out there," I replied, my voice tight with fear. "I think it's a cougar." Her eyes snapped fully awake, and I could see the fear take over her expression. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she was scared. I wasn't much better, honestly. We both lay there in silence, listening, the sounds of the cougar still just outside our tent. I had no weapon. I didn't carry a gun, and I had left my knife in the car. We were completely defenseless. All I could do was hope and pray that whatever it was, it would go away. Minutes dragged on, felt like hours, but I knew it couldn't have been that long. The growling stopped, but the animal was still close by, its presence unmistakable. I could hear it moving, its heavy footfalls just outside the thin fabric of the tent. My heart raced, adrenaline flooding my system. My breath came in shallow bursts, too afraid to make a sound, too afraid to move. Every second felt like it could be my last. The two of us sat there in the dark, the silence almost unbearable. I couldn't bring myself to sleep, even if I had wanted to. Every sound from the outside made my heart leap into my throat. Every rustle of the wind in the trees, every distant crack of a twig, it all made me jump. We sat, tense, waiting. I kept thinking about what I'd read about mountain lions, how they stalk their prey, how they attack without warning. It felt like we were sitting ducks, waiting for an attack we couldn't defend ourselves against. We prayed. I don't know if it was for comfort or for strength or for the animal to just go away. But we prayed, and we held each other's hands tightly, not speaking but knowing that the situation was dire. I couldn't hear the cougar anymore, but I knew it was still out there. I kept imagining its yellow eyes glaring through the darkness, watching for any sign of weakness. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, but eventually, after what seemed like an eternity, the growling stopped. The heavy footsteps faded away. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the calm, peaceful silence I'd hoped for. It was the kind of silence that comes after danger has passed, but it still leaves a lingering sense of unease. We didn't dare move for a while, not until we were sure the cougar had really gone. I don't know how long it took before I finally fell back into an exhausted, restless sleep. When I woke up in the morning, the sun was up, and the world outside looked peaceful again. Birds were chirping, the river was still rushing, and everything seemed normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had gripped me the night before. The rest of the group gathered around the campfire later that morning, chatting and laughing, unaware of the terror we had faced. When I told them about the cougar, I was met with mixed reactions. Some laughed it off, saying I'd probably just heard a coyote or a bear. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what had been outside our tent. It wasn't until later that I found out the truth. Apparently, the cougars, if that's what they were, weren't cougars at all. They were a couple of guys from the other campsite, a group of older men in their 30s who thought it would be funny to play around and make animal noises to freak us out. They had been lurking around our tent, growling and making strange sounds in the dark, trying to mess with us. They had no idea how terrifying it had been for us, how we had been terrified for our lives, convinced we were going to be attacked. I don't know if I should have been mad or relieved. Part of me was angry that they had played such a dangerous game, but another part of me was just thankful it wasn't really a cougar. Either way, the whole experience shook me up. I couldn't look at camping the same way after that. The peace of the woods, the calmness of nature, it all felt tainted somehow, as if the wild had turned on me, even if it hadn't. I left the campsite the next morning. The idea of staying another night after all that had happened was too much. I packed up my things, said my goodbyes, and left with my friends, heading back to civilization. The whole experience left a bad taste in my mouth. I didn't even want to talk about it anymore. It wasn't just the fear or the danger. It was the realization that something as simple as a night in the woods could turn into a nightmare without any warning. I haven't gone camping since. The idea of spending another night out there, in the quiet of the woods, knowing what can happen when things go wrong, just doesn't appeal to me. I know I'll never forget the fear of that night, the terror of knowing there was something out there that could kill us at any moment. And I'll always wonder if it was the animals we were supposed to fear, or something much worse. I decided to take a solo camping trip in early October, right after the first frost of the season. I wanted to get away for a few days, just to clear my head and enjoy the cold air in silence. There's a river in a remote part of the national forest that I'd only been to once before. It's not on any popular hiking trail, no marked campsites, and you have to drive 25 minutes down a narrow dirt road that's more ruts and potholes than anything else. After that, you hike in another 2 miles with no real trail to speak of, just following deer paths and the sound of water. That's exactly what I was looking for. No people, no noise, just trees, the river, and whatever animals were still lingering after the summer. I drove out in my beat-up Forerunner with my pack, my tent, a bear canister, food for 4 days, and enough gear to stay warm even if the temps dropped below freezing at night. I even brought a small hatchet to split wood for fires, though I'd have to collect deadfall since you're not allowed to cut living trees. I had my topo maps and a compass too, but I'd been there before and felt like I remembered the way. The drive-in took forever. The dirt road was worse than I remembered. Fallen branches scratched against the sides of the truck, and I had to stop a few times to move logs or big rocks out of the way. No one had driven through there in a long time. Once I finally parked, I locked up the truck and started hiking in. I knew the river was about 2 miles southeast, mostly downhill through thick pine forest with a few open meadows along the way. I got to the river after maybe an hour and a half. I followed the water upstream another half-mile until I found a little clearing I remembered. It sat back from the water about 30 feet and was surrounded by a natural horseshoe of boulders and thick brush. The trees formed a high canopy overhead, and you could barely see the sky except straight above. It felt tucked away, almost hidden, which I liked. It was about 4 p.m. when I dropped my pack and started setting up. I got the tent pitched just before sunset. It was already getting cold. I threw on my thicker jacket and went out to find wood. There was plenty of dry stuff near the base of the trees, and I found a few bigger dead limbs that I could break apart for a longer burn. I got a fire going with some effort and made a quick dinner, ramen and jerky. Simple but warm. I sat near the fire as the sky went fully dark, listening to the river and the occasional rustle from the trees. It was peaceful, but something started to feel a little off around 9 p.m. I kept catching a faint clicking or tapping sound from the trees behind my tent. At first I thought it was water dripping, maybe pine cones falling, but it didn't sound like that. It had a weird rhythm, like 3 quick taps, then a pause, then 2 more. I turned my headlamp toward the sound a few times but never saw anything. I figured maybe it was a woodpecker or something nesting up there. Still, it gave me this strange feeling in my chest, just an edge of discomfort. I stayed by the fire a little longer than I normally would have, then doused it, packed my food into the bear canister, and wedged it under a big rock about 30 yards from camp. I climbed into the tent, zipped up the flap, and crawled into my sleeping bag. It was cold, but not unbearable. I read a few pages of my book by headlamp and then turned it off. I didn't sleep much that first night. I kept waking up. It wasn't that I was cold. I just couldn't relax. I kept hearing that same tapping or clicking sound, sometimes farther away, sometimes closer. A few times it sounded like it was maybe 10 feet from the tent. I thought about raccoons or squirrels, maybe even a fox, but I never heard rustling or sniffing or any movement. Just that same dry, deliberate tapping. Around 3 a.m., I finally drifted off for a bit and didn't wake again until light started filtering through the trees. I crawled out and stretched. Everything looked normal. No signs of animals. No tracks in the soft dirt around my tent. I made breakfast and hiked up the ridge behind my camp just to scout. From the top, you could see across the river valley and down into the pine forest beyond. No smoke, no tents, no sign of other people. I spent the day wandering up and down the river. Fished a bit, caught nothing. Collected more wood, made some tea, cleaned up camp. It was colder than the day before, and some of the water near the rocks had a thin layer of ice in the shadows. I kept my jacket on all day. By late afternoon, I was already feeling tired. I made dinner, got the fire going early, and tried to push away the unease from the night before. I told myself I'd imagine the noise, or it was just small animals. It was silly to get worked up over nothing. That night I was exhausted and climbed into my sleeping bag early. The fire was still glowing, but I figured it would die out soon. I lay there listening to the wind in the trees and the flow of the river. It should have been calming, but I still felt tense. Then around midnight, I woke up again. There was no sound at first, just silence. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something's watching you. Then I heard it again, tapping. Same rhythm. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. It was closer this time, much closer. I sat up and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. My eyes adjusted and I scanned the tree line with my headlamp. Nothing moved, but the tapping started again behind me this time. I spun around, turned the light that way, still nothing. No eyes reflecting, no movement, just the trees. I told myself it had to be a tree branch swaying and hitting something, maybe one of the boulders. I tried to go back to sleep, but the sound kept coming every 10 minutes or so. Then it would stop, then start again, then stop. I finally passed out again sometime after 2 a.m. In the morning, I got up and walked the perimeter of my campsite. I found something I hadn't seen the day before. Fresh mud on one of the bigger boulders, smudged like someone had slipped climbing over it. There were also a few scuff spots in the dirt, like boot tracks that had been half erased. I knelt and looked closer. It didn't look like animal prints, not hooves or paws. It looked like the ball of a foot, but the prints were vague. The dirt was soft, but not soft enough to hold clear prints. I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't seen another person since I left the car. I wasn't anywhere near a trail. If someone had come through here, they were either extremely lost or didn't want to be seen. Either way, it felt wrong. I kept my axe with me that whole day. I didn't go far from camp. Every time I stepped away, I kept turning back, checking the trees. I barely ate that night. I just boiled water, choked down a few bites, and sat by the fire, gripping the axe. It was dead quiet. No wind, no bugs, not even birds. Just the river. I stayed up until maybe midnight, then finally crawled into the tent. I left the axe right next to me and didn't zip the flap all the way shut. I wanted to hear if anything came close. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard something different. Not tapping this time. Not rustling. Breathing. Low, steady breathing, just outside the tent. Not animal breathing. Not sniffing or panting. Just quiet, steady breaths. Like someone was standing right outside, trying not to make a sound. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise and my mouth went dry. I reached slowly for the axe. My hand was shaking. I couldn't hear footsteps, just that soft breathing. Then it stopped. I waited for what felt like hours. Finally, I peeked out the flap. Nothing. The fire had gone out, and the only light came from the moon filtering through the trees. I sat there in silence, staring into the dark for what must have been another hour before I finally backed into the sleeping bag and closed the flap. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I packed everything. Fast. Didn't even eat. Just stuffed my gear into the pack, grabbed the bear canister, and started hiking. I didn't take the usual way back. I cut uphill, climbing fast and not stopping, trying to stay off the obvious deer trails. Every few minutes I stopped and listened. I never heard anyone, never saw anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me for days. When I finally reached the truck, it looked untouched. No broken windows, no signs of anyone. I climbed in and locked the doors immediately. I didn't relax until I hit pavement nearly 40 minutes later. I drove straight home without stopping. Back home, I checked the local news and forest alerts. Nothing. No missing persons. No reports of strange activity. Nothing at all. But something was out there. Someone. I've been camping alone for years. I've dealt with bears, storms, even minor injuries far from help. But I've never felt fear like I did on that trip. Not fear of animals. Fear of people. Of being watched. Followed. I haven't been back to that river since. I doubt I ever will. I still go camping, but I stay near trails now. Near people. I don't need total solitude anymore. I'd rather hear someone's music through the trees than sit alone in the dark wondering if I'm being hunted. Because whatever that was, whoever that was, they were out there on purpose. And they didn't want to be found.